The lady runs after the main hero, beseeching his aid as the countess suffered from dizziness, and the other women were unable to help her reach her chamber. Finally, Karsel halted and turned his attention to the lady, his smile enchanting. At that moment, the maiden comprehended why this man was considered the most handsome in the region. The lady explained that no young man had agreed to assist them, making the arrival of the lord in their domain a stroke of great fortune. The main hero understood that the matter was indeed urgent and of utmost importance, and thus, he consented to help. In no time, Karsel was carrying the ailing countess in his arms, and she found herself admiring the young man. Moreover, Karsel's grandfather had been renowned for his seafaring exploits, which were considered perilous and still held that reputation. However, the title bore responsibilities, and one must treat it with proper regard. In the end, the lady showed initiative and kissed the desired lord, a gesture that was coveted by many women. Escalante, one of the most prominent families in the alliance of 17 aristocratic houses. Its heir was the strikingly handsome Karsel Escalante, highly esteemed in society. He particularly charmed women, effortlessly captivating those much older than himself, even as a teenager. By the age of 23, he had been involved with various girls and women. Naturally, his aid to the countess did not conclude without a reason, as he now finds himself kissing her, pressing her against the wall. In truth, the young man does not comprehend his actions or why he chose to act in such a manner. However, recalling his betrothed, he grasps the true reason. The countess also mentions Inez, whom, in her opinion, is unworthy of such a magnificent suitor as the lord. The young lady dresses akin to a nun, and her gaze is forever listless and detached. While the countess continues to speak hurtful things about the main hero's future wife, the young man notices that Inez stands nearby. Thus, many years after the engagement ceremony, the maiden learns for the first time of her betrothed's betrayal. Karsel recalls the insulting remarks aristocrats always directed at his future bride and the offensive words she had to endure. Approaching the mansion in a carriage belonging to the Valentina de Perez family, the main hero was determined to address the issue of what he had seen and heard concerning his future wife. Even while walking through the estate, the young man attempted to justify his transgression to himself by claiming that infidelity had become a norm in modern aristocratic society. However, in contrast to these facts, there were moral laws that emphasized the necessity of remaining faithful to one's spouse. Regardless, as Karsel is not yet married, he believes he should indulge in as much pleasure as possible before the wedding. Inez awaited the young man in the drawing room and merely nodded briefly upon noticing her guest and the servant. The lord wished to know the reason why the lady had refused to meet him for several consecutive days, but she attributed it all to the inclement weather, which was unsuitable for the gentleman's journey. It was evident that even in comparison to her usual indifference, the young lady's current emotions were pronounced. Not surprisingly, she must have been deeply hurt upon witnessing direct betrayal from her beloved. At present, Inez did not particularly wish to discuss the situation she had found herself in a few days ago. Regardless, Karsel was certain that his betrothed was in love with him. Such was the case and would always be so. In her childhood, Inez consciously chose the main hero as her fiancé, forsaking the opportunity to become a member of the ruling family. Over 17 years, the young woman had numerous chances to reconsider her decision, yet she never did so. Inez's love was unrequited, causing significant distress to the young man upon whom this sentiment was directed. Now, however, Karsel requests an opportunity to explain, but there is no need for it. His betrothed has seen enough. This drove the lord to the brink of madness. In a similar situation, any other young lady would have screamed and caused a scene. Therefore, the young man attempted to convince Inez that she should be angered and upset after such an incident. The maiden, however, insisted on her stance, asserting that she and the main hero were not close enough to discuss such matters. Moreover, she is well aware of all his previous escapades. She is far from foolish. For Inez, there was no reason to restrict the young man's freedom since he meant absolutely nothing to her. After these words, all of the main hero's convictions collapsed. He realized how greatly mistaken he was in naively thinking that the young lady was madly in love with him. When Karsel learned in his childhood that he would spend his entire life with his future wife, he attempted to ascertain the duration of that life. Everyone merely laughed at the little boy's naivety, and Inez herself understood that he did not truly comprehend the meaning of those words. This angered the young lord, prompting him to try to prove that he actually knew about such matters as well as anyone else, when in reality, that was not the case. Duke Lionel Valestina summoned his daughter for a conversation about her behavior towards the boy. The gentleman lectured the young girl on the fact that she would always be more intelligent than others, but that did not warrant treating them with disdain. Even if the person beside her fails to grasp elementary things, it is necessary to kindly explain to him, as befitting a true lady. Inez even managed to argue with her father in a manner that allowed her to have the last word and prove her point. However, the Duke's daughter still attempted to philosophically explain the length of life to her fiancé. In her view, only the deceased could reliably answer the question posed, having already passed through death. Such words frightened the young man due to his childish thinking. He took all of his fiancé's words literally. To make it easier for the child to understand the information conveyed, the young lady explained life differently, as the time until death. The boy also learned about death not long ago when his grandfather passed away after losing his leg. From all of this, Carcel drew the conclusion that he should either amputate his own leg or marry Inez. This dreadful choice brought him to tears when the girl informed the main hero that, in addition to the wedding, they would also have a child. The boy fell into despair. Meanwhile, the Empress joyfully announced to the aristocrats about the future couple, now officially engaged, inviting them to raise their glasses in their honor. From this moment on, the young lord's life began to veer off course, as he was deprived of the choice of his future. The heir to the throne, Prince Oscar, was displeased with Inez's choice, as for some unknown reason, she refused to marry the ruler's son. He was convinced that Carcel must have employed some cunning to win the young lady's heart. The boy was merely 6 years old. He could not have done anything like that, nor did he want to. But His Majesty did not care. Oscar already regarded the Duke's daughter as his own possession, which was so boldly stolen. The prince believed that at this moment, an alliance with the Duke's family, specifically with the ruling branch, should have been formed. However, the Empress never once condemned the girl for bluntly rejecting Oscar. While she thought this marriage could be advantageous, she did not like the girl herself. The prince also considered her foolish and called her a raven-haired girl. He had no sympathy for Inez, only a strong desire to possess her. Since there was still plenty of time until the wedding, His Majesty hoped to make the girl his bride. And right now, he was planning to visit her. Two young boys found Inez in the library, and their visit was highly unexpected. Nevertheless, she endeavored to observe the rules of etiquette in their conversation. Even the girl's parents were not at home on that day, making the situation even more uncomfortable for her. She tried to dismiss the uninvited guests as quickly as possible, as they were interfering with her reading. The prince, however, was quite insistent. He initiated a conversation about a book Inez had given him on a previous occasion. In his attempt to express admiration for the plot, he inadvertently revealed that his passion for literature hindered his preparations for his role as a ruler. The young lady expressed her regret, as she had advised Oscar to read something that distracted him from his duties. It was evident that the heir to the empire possessed an inflated self-esteem and firmly declared that no one better than him would be found by the girl. His Highness decided to give Inez a chance to change her decision about marrying the main hero. He did so with a smirk, evidently expecting the girl to agree. Nevertheless, the young girl had no intention of altering anything. She had already turned down the prince once and was doing the same now. Observing Carcel, who cowardly remained behind Oscar, unwilling to engage in an altercation, the girl could not understand why her fiancé did not defend her. Only after this incident did the young lord shut himself off from his future wife, from whom the prince could not detach himself. Oscar continued to stand his ground, arrogantly discussing the reasons for the Duke's daughter's refusal of his proposal. Inez used the headache she developed during the conversation with the intruder and asked her fiancé to accompany her to her room. Though the prince attempted to threaten him with his status, the girl made it clear to the main hero that, as long as he was a child, he was not obliged to obey nobles. Inez herself was confident and unafraid of the ruling family, a trait that seemed commendable. But Carcel still deemed her unworthy. When the girl was alone with the main hero, she decided to wash his hands, not even waiting for his consent. The serving maid who approached the children was no less shocked than the boy himself, as she had never seen him behave this way before. Unexpectedly, Inez addressed the main hero by his surname rather than his given name, as she had done previously. This displeased the child, and over time, he managed to persuade his future wife to revert to their previous form of address. Even in his childhood, Carcel understood that the Duke's daughter was quite peculiar, as rumors circulated about her attachment to the boy. But he was certain that they were false. She behaved coldly and distantly towards the child, yet this did not necessarily reflect her true feelings towards the young lord. Inez argued with her future husband, asserting that he was mistaken. While it was true that she chose him for his appearance and the potential benefits he could bring, she was not indifferent to him. The fiancé of the Duke's daughter felt no sympathy for the girl, But that was of no concern, for he was content to know about her feelings. Now, 17 years later, the mature main hero sat in Ani's room, waiting to meet with her. He realized the troubles he had brought upon himself after revealing his betrayal when his future wife directly expressed her indifference towards him. In the lady's chamber, nothing had changed for many years. Nonetheless, the Lord hoped to find something that indicated a change in her character. The young lady was not pleased with the unexpected visit of an uninvited guest to her room, and she attempted to discover the reason for such a rude act. Despite the situation, Carcel still thought of his fiancée's external beauty, which was evident even under the somber attire she habitually wore. The young man tried to ascertain if his fiancée was offended, seemingly unable to believe her indifference. During the conversation, he made various conjectures about the reasons behind her words, reaching even absurd assumptions, such as Ani's being concerned about his feelings and fearing to hurt him. The girl had grown weary of listening to such nonsense. Carcel acted as if she had found another man and made him jealous. Such a scenario was hardly plausible for a quiet lady like her, as most men were hardly worthy of her attention. Despite all of the Lord's betrayals, Ines still did not want to break off their engagement, as he met the minimum requirements to become her husband. If the young lady truly loved the main hero, she would have killed him in case of betrayal. Thus her indifference is perhaps for the best. And since she has no affection for the young man, the Duke's daughter will not waste her energy on him. The Lord does not want to leave everything as it is. He seizes his fiancée's hand and demands to be heard. Ines still does not want to talk about it, as all the unfaithful can offer her are empty explanations for their actions. At some point, Carcel himself ceased to understand the motives behind his actions. He has no reason to justify himself to a fiancé he does not love. The lady begins to weep. She is genuinely distressed by what she has witnessed, and concealing her jealousy is no longer possible. The main hero draws his future wife closer, embracing her by the waist, assuring her that there is no intimate connection between him and the Countess. Ines remains distraught. It would be foolish to believe these words after witnessing everything with her own eyes. Suddenly, the young man felt a sharp desire for closeness with the Duke's daughter. He could not hide it, and thus the girl herself took notice. This only made her weep even harder, not knowing how to behave with such a repulsive man. The Lord tried to justify the situation by claiming that it was precisely because it was Ines by his side. He wouldn't feel such an attraction towards another lady. Suddenly, even the lady's mood changed. Now she no longer repelled her fiancé, but rather, she implored him to prove his feelings for her. She expressed her reciprocated desire, as she had harbored similar feelings during every encounter with the young man and had long awaited this moment. Suspecting it to be a mere dream, Carcel began kissing his fiancée's lips, giving her what she desired so much. Suddenly, the main hero woke up and realized that these scenes were indeed just dreams. The young man was awakened by the lad who demanded a sparring session with the Lord, as he had promised earlier. While relaxing in the bath, Carcel pondered what had happened. He was still troubled by the indifference with which the Duke's daughter now treated him. In truth, he did not understand why he should worry about it when even the young lady accepted the fact of his betrayal calmly. On the contrary, he should be happy, as he had finally found the desired freedom. Later, during a weapons training session with his ward, the Lord decided to discuss his recent concern about Ines. In reality, any man should be happy to have the opportunity to do whatever he pleases. After marriage, men are usually kept in check by their wives, but in Carcel's case, everything was different. Though from the outside, it might appear as the lady caring for her future spouse, in reality, it was quite the opposite. As a result, deciding to make use of the freedom granted to him, the young man once again secluded himself with the lady. She admired the Lord, as it was only in his presence that she felt such intense desire, which made him special. However, Carcel suddenly decided to end the encounter before it even began, and therefore, he intended to leave the lady alone. She didn't understand the reason for such abrupt changes at first and was quite upset, but her admiration for the Lord was so strong that she soon took his rejection as a jest. The young man was immersed in his thoughts. He did not understand what was happening to his body, as after that dream, he desired no intimacy with any woman other than his fiancée. Later, while at the theater, the main hero contemplated his current state, which was quite pitiable. The situation itself seemed like a curse or a malady, but one that could not have taken hold at such a young age. Moreover, thoughts of the Duke's daughter brought his state back to normal, which was very strange. The young man was convinced that Ines would not attend today's play, as she often avoided such events, but he was mistaken. The lady took her place next to him, apologizing for her lateness. She was exceedingly gracious and even felt the need to appear at the event with her future spouse. As always, the Duke's daughter's speech adhered entirely to all etiquette rules, leaving the main hero feeling ignorant in her presence. Inez noticed how nervously her future husband behaved and attempted to find the reason for such conduct. What followed after that, Karsel remembered vaguely, but in the end, he found himself in the carriage with his betrothed after the play. Moreover, they had already arrived at their destination and it was time to disembark, yet the young man could not recall a single word spoken by his companion, nor even the journey itself. Even the fact that they had arrived at Lord Escalante's estate seemed unexpected to him, which upset his wife. Inez requested that the young man refrain from such behavior in the future, as it could become a problem for both of them. First, they had to step out of the carriage, and, of course, the aristocrat politely offered his hand to the lady as they disembarked. Though they appeared to be an excellent couple, for Karsel, this moment was terribly agonizing. Eventually, for their conversation, the future spouses chose the drawing room of the Escalante family mansion, which Inez considered too large and foreshadowed a private conversation. When they were in the young lady's house, they didn't have the chance to finish their conversation, as the lord departed too quickly. The Duke's daughter understood that her future husband had concealed his infidelity in an attempt to show respect for her, and she highly valued such actions. Learning this, the young man concluded that he had perceived a sign of deep attachment from the lady, not fully comprehending his own situation. However, Inez continued her speech, intending to convey something entirely different. That Karsel was no longer obliged to hide his relationships with other ladies. From that day forward, throughout their married life, they would be mere formal spouses to each other, until one of them displayed open rudeness to the partner. This shocked the main hero. He never expected such a reaction, even after all the words about the young lady's indifference towards him. However, the lord still decided that the Duke's daughter was engaging in such behavior to be involved with other men. He approached Inez at an indecently close distance, even going so far as to sit on the table. Such a gesture seemed inappropriate to the young lady, but her future spouse couldn't care less. He bluntly expressed his repugnant assumption about his fiancée's infidelity. Moreover, Karsel thought there might be several men involved, as he considered the lady quite attractive. In reality, the young lady had entirely different reasons for allowing her future husband to have extramarital affairs. Since childhood, his life changed due to this engagement. He was deprived of choice and even forced into inheriting the title ahead of time. Their wedding was supposed to take place several years ago, but Karsel actively avoided that day. To accomplish this, he even joined the military academy and served in the army immediately after. For Inez, this postponement was also a relief, as she, too, wasn't eagerly anticipating the marriage, though she didn't regard it with hatred. Now, as compensation for all those years, the young lady would endeavor to grant her future husband as much freedom as possible before and after the ceremony. The main hero couldn't believe these words. In his opinion, the Duke's daughter must have had some hidden motive for such actions. Unexpectedly, Karsel leaned even closer to the young lady and, without permission, kissed her. He disagreed with the proposed model of their relationship and marriage, as it did not align with his understanding of a shared life. After the wedding, he would remain faithful only to his spouse and not be in the company of other women. He tried to prove that he could be a worthy husband and satisfy all his wife's needs. Inez had already lived more than one life. She experienced death for the first time at the age of 26. Only at that moment did the young lady realize how short and fleeting her life could be. Therefore, the main heroine was able to give such a clear response to her fiancé about the length of the life's journey during her early childhood. That demise was a consequence of decisions made by the Duke's daughter. She still remembers the feelings of hopelessness she had at that moment. Back then, she had status and enjoyed her life with expensive things and unconventional adornments. The Duke spared no expense for his daughter, and over time, Inez became an exemplar of fashion. At that time, young ladies did everything possible to make their skin paler, but when the main heroine returned from vacation with a sun-kissed complexion, tanning became popular. She chose the crown prince as her husband, and society was thrilled with the future princess, and the prince himself loved her. However, even with an ideal life, Inez wanted to make it even better and therefore ordered beautiful dresses and chose invitations to events beneficial to her. The young lady tried to create the illusion that maintaining her ideal figure required no effort, and so she ate large portions in public and induced nausea afterwards. The motivations behind her actions were unknown to the main heroine. Perhaps she strived for her husband's sake or for her ideal life. It is doubtful that the Duke's daughter could love such a dreadful man, who was the heir to the empire. Throughout her time, Inez lost 4 unborn children and remained alone in her sorrow. The imperial family only condemned her, calling her cursed, and her husband refused to defend her. Over time, the main heroine learned the reason for such misfortunes. The crown prince bore a burden of numerous ailments due to leading a dissolute and indecent life. Even during her pregnancy, His Highness did not hesitate to abuse her in his attempts to satisfy his desires. Despite Inez never doing anything wrong in her entire life, she received punishments for her ill-advised choice of a spouse. The worst part was that Oscar was aware of all his illnesses, yet he continued to torment the unfortunate lady, disregarding her feelings. When the main heroine decided to end her life, she was even relieved that she couldn't bear a child. In front of her husband's eyes, she met death with a smile, as subjecting a girl to such a fate would be a terrible stain on the prince's reputation. In the end, her death didn't create problems for anyone. Only the will revealed all the sins of the empire's heir. Hoping to find herself in a better world, Inez suddenly found herself in the hunting grounds where she spent her childhood and couldn't comprehend what had happened. The first thing the young lady did was run along the forest, and her brother chased after her, not understanding what was happening. Eventually, she collapsed by the roots of a tree, weeping and trying to make sense of it all, finding it hard to believe it wasn't a dream. A little later, while in her bedroom, she couldn't believe that Luciano, her brother, looked so young. The young man couldn't help but notice how strangely his sister was behaving, so he attempted to understand the reason behind it. Juana, the main heroine's maid, was convinced that it was all because of the upcoming wedding with the crown prince, which the young lady had been eagerly anticipating. The lady herself was equally astonished to see her at this age, which appeared quite extraordinary to those around her. Inez recalled how in her previous life, she left her childhood home after her wedding and never returned there again. People and places that had been dear to her for so many years were now a distant past, no longer appearing in her life. Now, she was once again content to be in their company, and to witness beautiful spring flowers from her window. Luciano informed the main heroine of the imminent trip to the imperial palace, where they would seek flaws in her. Perhaps the girl had forgotten about it. In any case, she still considered herself unworthy of the crown prince, despite leading a fairly honorable and public life. Upon hearing these dreadful words from her brother's lips, Inez seized him by the neck and began to scream, refuting his claims vehemently. She couldn't fathom that someone would say such things to her after all she had endured in her past life. Consumed by anger, the young lady even struck the young man's face several times, terrifying the maid greatly. Before launching another attack, the main heroine paused, realizing that this was her new reality, and she couldn't openly apply her past experiences here. After ending her life in the wake of all the hardships, she had hoped to enter paradise, but instead, she was forced to go through all that suffering once again. Left alone, Inez contemplated how to proceed and alter her future path. Oscar is regarded as a virtuous man, even preserving his chastity until the wedding to share the ritual of the first bridal night with his spouse. No one would believe the main heroine if she were to reveal his escapades and numerous intimate ailments within a couple of years. This time, the young woman decided not to waste her life on a terrible man as she had done before and, using cunning, evade the impending marriage. The household servants noticed that the young lady had fallen in love with the portrait artist who visited their home. In this life, Inez experienced true love upon meeting Emiliano, an artist of the arts. She took the initiative with him, craving intimacy, though it was deemed improper. The young man reciprocated her feelings, having fallen in love with the duke's daughter at first sight, though she seemed unattainable to him. Then the lady eloped with her beloved and lived happily with him, albeit in poverty, for 4 years. Afterward, the main heroine's brother found them and killed Emiliano right before Inez's weeping eyes, while she held their child in her arms. Although the man had previously managed to escape with the help of others, at some point, he faced his demise willingly. The young lady was forcibly taken back home, not even allowed to bid farewell to the man she had been close to for so many years. After one misfortune, a second followed. Inez overheard a conversation between her father and brother about her impending wedding with the count. During this discussion, the men also mentioned the need to closely monitor the young lady and eliminate the child she had brought with her after fleeing. The duke's daughter did not want the infant to meet death at the hands of a stranger, and therefore saw no other way but to kill the child herself. Indeed, the artist made the young lady's life joyful, but unfortunately, it was all too brief. After the death of the infant, the main heroine herself departed from this world, using the keen edge of a dagger. Therefore, in this life, Inez carefully planned everything and chose a husband known for his appearance, so that he would change her and everyone could lead their own lives. However, after Carcel's words about his fidelity to the girl, Her plan was already threatened, but she still couldn't comprehend where she had gone wrong. Such a libertine as this lord, for some unknown reason, becomes an entirely different person and betrays the intentions of his betrothed. Juana attended to her mistress's feet and spoke to her about her future fiancé, who seemed to have finally become sensible. However, therein lay the main problem. Inez wanted the lord to remain the same as he is now. In any case, there is a high likelihood that Carcel's words were merely lies, concocted to reconcile with the girl before their wedding. The servant did not want to believe such an outcome, as she regarded soldiers as honorable people who do not speak falsely. Rather mercilessly, the duke's daughter spoke the harsh truth to her maid, so that she wouldn't harbor false hopes. Anyone can lie regardless of their status. Exhausted, the main heroine reclined on the divan and drifted into sleep, hoping her efforts would not be in vain. Meanwhile, Carcel's assistant decided to report the information about his wife, which he had obtained at his master's orders. From all the sources, it was evident that Inez had no lover, as each informant confirmed this. However, the lord still refused to believe in his future wife's innocence, as they questioned the servants of her family, who were unlikely to tell the truth. The assistant reminded the young man that they had already sent a letter proposing marriage to his bride's house, and canceling the engagement would be difficult. In his opinion, it was with this purpose that the main character sought information about the girl's relationships with other men. In reality, he had no intention of doing so, as he had envisioned his life since the age of 6 with no other prospect than marrying this young lady. Moreover, considering all his infidelities, such a pretext would be quite foolish. Almost immediately after the wedding ceremony, Carcel would be forced to leave for service, and naturally, his assistant would have to accompany him. 10 days before the wedding, the families of Inez and the lord gathered around one table, and the atmosphere seemed quite tense. Duke was the first to speak, as he had already learned about all the misdeeds of his daughter's future husband and now engaged in conversation with him in a rude and sarcastic manner. In the end, he was no longer so certain that such a man would be a worthy match for his daughter. Not fully understanding how to respond to such accusations, the young man tried to reassure the Duke that he would make his daughter happy after their wedding. However, Duke was not quick to trust the words of such a scoundrel. After all, he hadn't even paid a single compliment to his bride during the dinner. The main heroine tried to defend Carcel, as marrying him was part of her plans. The Duke was furious. Nothing could calm him in this situation because, like any father, he wanted the best for his daughter. Each of the young man's actions indicated his reluctance to marry Inez, and weddings are not usually postponed for such a prolonged period. The girl's mother was drinking very strong alcohol, which confused everyone present. The accusations from the Duke went beyond decency, as he even accused the lord of engaging in the trafficking of bodies. Inez was also angered by everything that was happening, and now she was determined to calm her father down. Although, in truth, the man's reaction was quite expected, as Carcel, as a groom, had not been very well behaved. This also explained why Duke had not objected all the time the wedding ceremony was postponed. He wanted the engagement to be cancelled. While his daughter was older than the average marriageable age in the empire, it would not be a problem to find another suitor for her, given her family's high standing. Then the girl decided to lie about loving her fiancé to put an end to this torrent of accusations. When the dreadful dinner finally concluded, Inez's mother called the lord for a conversation and conveyed that she did not agree with her husband's opinion. The woman never wanted her daughter to turn out the way she eventually did. Before, she was no different from other children. It all happened after a severe fever, which she barely survived, when it seemed like another person had taken possession of her body. Once, the mother merely suggested that her little girl tidy herself up, but the response she received was outright aggression. Since then, the Duchess had grown afraid of this child, and thus she did not raise her properly as a mother should. During the evening, the Duchess even found something to criticize Inez about. The girl ate a lot without considering her figure. She hoped that her husband would be able to improve this insufferable girl after their marriage, but he had no intentions of doing so. The only praise the main heroine received from her mother was for her engagement with a handsome boy in early childhood when he did not yet understand what was going on and could not refuse. The Duchess reminded the future husband of her daughter about how deeply upset he had been when he learned of the impending wedding with Inez. The little girl was completely different then, as if she had planned everything perfectly, and everything went according to her ideal scheme. While the families of the future spouses conversed among themselves, they also decided to discuss their concerns privately. Inez was worried that the words of the Duke might have caused him discomfort, as her father was truly overly angered. However, the main heroine was quite dissatisfied with the postponement of their wedding date, as she would have to wear her mother's old dress, which clearly could not please her. In any case, after so many delays, the girl would be delighted to marry her desired man, so she was ready to turn a blind eye to his selfishness. After that, Anise began gently hinting to Carcel that he should not suppress his attraction to other women, as she did not mind at all. This did not sit well with the Lord, as it gave him the impression that someone was trying to impose an opinion on him that was foreign to him. He was not afraid to openly accuse his fiancée of this behavior. Such actions seemed very strange coming from her. Doubts arose in Carcel regarding whether he was ever pleasing to his wife or not, as she seemed to be trying to get rid of him. Anise argued against it, as such statements from an adulterer appeared to be devoid of any meaning. The main heroine was even willing to offend her future husband, comparing him to a lustful hound, in order to use it as a pretext for her current decisions. When Carcel mentioned their shared bedroom they would inhabit after the wedding, the girl hastened to disappoint him. Their rooms would be separate. The young man did not mind the comparison to a male dog, only seeking reasons to be closer to his bride. He did not want to sleep separately and saw no compelling reasons for such rigid boundaries between them during their married life. Moreover, he forcefully kissed the Duke's daughter again, despite her clear disapproval of such an attitude. This shocked the Lord, as no one had dared to do such a thing to him before. Everyone regarded his features as almost a sacred icon. Furthermore, the young man received a warning. He should not treat Anise in such a manner, even when they might occasionally share a bed. Such intimate relations were necessary only to prevent their relatives from further criticizing this marriage. According to the young lady, their wedding overall resembled a spectacle for society, but the main protagonist did not share the same sentiment. He had always known that the Duke's daughter would become his wife, thus making her the sole woman for him. Now he seeks forgiveness for his conduct. That kiss was indeed uncalled for, and he shall not act against the girl's will anymore. However, for her to achieve this, she must express her discontent in their relationship, and until then, kisses shall be prohibited. Finally, the long-awaited day of their wedding arrived, and the bells announced it even to commoners. During the ceremony, Anise was not dressed in black for the first time and looked exquisite, a fact noticed by everyone, including her groom. The event carried its special atmosphere, although not everyone was content with this union. The girl entrusted her hand and heart to Carcel, addressing him by name as she confidently kissed her now fully recognized spouse. The celebration was private, with only select aristocratic families in attendance. None of the guests found the occasion dull or regretted being part of the festivities. The dance was taking place, and the bride was meant to dance with her brother. At that moment, Carcel gazed intently at her. To the bored young man, one of the guests approached, the future duke named Dante Ihar, who was a despicable individual. Compared to this philanderer, even the main protagonist was an honest man, devoted to his bride. However, what surprised them was that Anise's father, who desired to annul the engagement, made it clear that there were several candidates for the role of his daughter's husband. One of them was Enrique Osorno, renowned for his intellect and achievements in the field of science, distinguishing himself from those muscle-flaunting braggarts. The other candidate was Leonardo Helves, a young man several years younger than Anise, which would make him subordinate to her in all matters. And the last one was the very son of the Duke, Ihar, renowned for his integrity in his dealings with young ladies. Of course, this image was merely a facade he had successfully maintained for many years in society. The insolent man began to praise the appearance of the newlywed, which today looked nothing like her former self. Some even thought that the Duke had a second daughter all this time and only now presented her to society. For some reason, many believed that Anise had completely transformed with her external metamorphosis, but in reality, it was not so. The main protagonist remained the same as before, only striving to keep her composure amidst numerous influential individuals. Continuing to shower compliments towards the girl, Dante did not shy away from indecent expressions, and he even declared that he wanted to amuse himself with Carcel's wife once he got tired of her, as if she were an object, not a person. Even distinguished ladies could not believe what they saw before them. The unremarkable main heroine had become such a stunning lady. Dancing with her spouse, she appeared graceful and effortless, as if attending society events and moving to the rhythm of music were her everyday routine. When Dante asked the young man, he gave a clear answer, threatening to end his life if he found her boring. The future Duke, however, was certain that a wife should not be faithful to someone like the main protagonist, as he himself did not refrain from contact with other young ladies. This could also help Carcel himself, as if it were to happen, he would no longer be tormented by guilt for the infidelities he committed since the day of their engagement. Several men approached the main heroine that evening with similar propositions, which infuriated him greatly. In the end, even the crown prince decided to speak with the newlywed while his spouse conversed with the guests. he subtly initiated a conversation about wine taste. However, after a few sentences, he began to discuss directly the dreadful choice Inez had made in her life, as there were plenty of more suitable options around. Even now, the maiden engaged in a pleasant conversation with Enrique, which prompted Oscar to envision what a splendid pair they could make. Carcel found himself at a loss for words when confronted by the future ruler of the empire, as he saw no reason to philosophize about marriage. Being a bachelor himself, after Inez rejected him back in childhood, Oscar persisted in seeking her favor for a long time. But eventually he remained alone and reluctantly betrothed to the Marquis's niece. She was several years his junior, and he kept postponing the wedding ceremony, excusing it with her youthful age and appearance. Now, he attempted to sabotage the wedding for the groom, trying to prove that the main protagonist could genuinely smile alongside others, just not with him. And then, His Highness decided to display his impudence further, attempting to drink from the bride's goblet, yet Carcel did not permit him to do so. Subsequently, the insults turned towards the young man himself and his appearance, which he skillfully repelled with verbal dexterity. Before the ritual of their first wedding night, Juana implored her lady not to eat too much, for it might slightly mar her appearance. At the wedding, Inez indulged in delicacies, provoking the wrath of her mother, which was evident in the Duchess's gaze. The chambermaid also noticed that her mistress was far more sociable on this evening than usual. Moreover, she did not decline to dance with any of the esteemed gentlemen of the empire who invited her. She explained that she behaved this way solely because it was her wedding, and she needed to present herself in the best light to not disappoint her betrothed. Currently, many desired to court the maiden, even making requests to her parents, but they were weary of such propositions. All these suitors had shallow minds and were solely fixated on appearances, much like the girl herself in her former life. In this moment, she reminisced about her second life, where she was happy with her beloved, even if briefly. In any case, the preparations for the first wedding night were concluded, and it was time for Inez to proceed to her spouse. Usually, the very ceremony of marriage was more intended for society's benefit than for the future spouses themselves. The true ritual that cemented the bond between a couple in high society was considered to be the first wedding night. If, in the event, it proved to be unfruitful, the marriage could be annulled immediately, as if it had never taken place. Considering the interests of the main protagonist's father, he would do everything to render this union null and void. However, now Inez bore the name Escalante, and became the official representative of this lineage. Soon they would depart to live far from the girl's family, in a new mansion built by the seaside. The young man was ecstatic about the prospect of being alone with his spouse, a notion he had considered madness in the past. Now, it was he who was hopelessly in love, not Inez, which seemed entirely fair after years of the girl's anticipation. Carcel recalled how men chatted about their marriage and the possible lack of interest the groom might have in his newlywed wife in the near future, so they sought to console her. At that moment, the Duke's daughter entered the room, looking magnificent and fully prepared for the upcoming event. Her husband worried that Inez might walk through the mansion in such revealing attire and catch someone's gaze. The girl merely used this as an opportunity to jest before inviting her spouse to bed. The main protagonist aimed to showcase her ease and readiness for what was to come. Inez's husband decided to take control of the situation and carried the bride in his arms to the bed. He justified it by claiming that the Duke's daughter must have been exhausted after so many dances with various men at her wedding. Carcel's reaction seemed strange to the main protagonist, as she had not yet done anything indecent to provoke him. To avoid dwelling on the unpleasant process, the main protagonist endeavored to think of something extraneous. Inez reassured herself that this was just a part of her well-thought-out plan, and there were compelling reasons to endure it. The Duke's daughter hurried the young man, eager for the detested duty to be executed quickly so she could finally live in peace. Even in such a situation, Inez addressed her husband by his surname, showing no change in her attitude towards him. The main protagonist found it peculiar, and if anyone heard her from outside the room, they might think she intended to seduce the young man's younger brother. Seeing the lord without the upper part of his garment, the girl marveled at the imposing figure of this man. Surprisingly, Carcel did not want to rush everything, despite the circumstances being mere consequences rather than the desire of either spouse. Inez reminded the main protagonist of how strongly he resisted marrying her all those years they were engaged. However, now the Lord was ready to firmly express his disagreement with those words. Both parties desired this marriage. The young man couldn't understand why his wife still brought it up, as everything had long been settled and practically executed. Previously, the belief that there was a lady madly in love with him brought peace to Carcel's soul. Now he clearly understood it was no longer true. On the morning after, the newlyweds shared the meal with the main protagonist's parents, but it couldn't be called pleasant. It was because the girl's mother kept repeating her disbelief in what was happening and felt elated to be rid of the burden of caring for her detested daughter. The woman had already convinced herself that the wedding would never take place, and the union would be annulled at the engagement level. When the Duchess turned to her daughter's husband, expecting words of support, he tried to be restrained and didn't know how to respond. However, the woman was absolutely certain that Anise wasn't even listening to them, so they could say anything they pleased about her. Lately, she had completely stopped responding to criticism. This did not prevent the main protagonist's husband from defending her in front of her family. He was unwilling to support her mother's attacks on his spouse, and would also prefer to ignore them in the future. Now, the Lord extended his hand to his lady to depart with her, justifying it as time to set off to their new estate. Anise's father nodded approvingly, observing how the young man carried himself with dignity in such a challenging situation, despite his opinion of him as a scoundrel. After bidding farewell, the newlyweds began preparing for their imminent departure, as the journey ahead was expected to be arduous. Carcel noted that the Duchess's behavior was too malicious for a mother who should be concerned about her child, while the main protagonist tried to convince her husband that such attacks on her occurred quite rarely, at least due to the separate living arrangements. He found it hard to believe. Anise's reaction to these words, or rather her indifference, had been cultivated over the years of enduring such remarks directed at her. He was certain that regardless of their lineage, a young lady should not allow such treatment of herself. Unexpectedly, the young man changed the subject and apologized to the main protagonist for his actions during the previous night. He should not have treated his wife so disrespectfully and performed the ritual of the first bridal night without Anise's consent. In turn, the girl could not comprehend why Carcel was even uttering such words, as he had not been rude to her. On the contrary, he displayed restraint. In reality, she had taken measures to ensure her husband did not find gratification during the act, hoping he would seek companionship elsewhere in the future. Thus, the Duke's daughter asked the Lord not to worry about what happened and also apologized for her excessive shyness. The young man assured his spouse that she had acted correctly and, contrary to his expectations, conducted the ritual with dignity. While on the staircase, Anise stumbled and nearly fell, but the main protagonist helped her stay on her feet. Moreover, he lifted the girl in his arms and escorted her to the carriage, despite her protests. The household staff, who witnessed this scene between the newlyweds, were pleasantly astonished and started whispering among themselves, enthusiastically discussing the couple's affection for each other. 6 hours later, the newlyweds arrived at their new estate, which was not overly large. Throughout the entire carriage ride, the girl slept on Carcel's knees, which was not surprising given the sleepless night she had. Anise did not expect to accompany her husband even during his service, as she could have lived in a different city. It was customary in the families of those serving at sea for wives to see their husbands only during short-term leaves. However, couples living in port cities were an exception, and the locale itself was renowned for its beauty. This caused the main protagonist to recall her beloved from her past life and the fear of losing him. The girl's thoughts centered around a specific day when she was in a small fishing port with Emiliano, and somehow they encountered the main protagonist, who aided the artist in escaping. To acquire a residence in this small town, Carcel presented a special gift to his superior. It was a rifle, considered highly valuable among military personnel, and deemed worthy of exchanging for accommodation. The man was delighted to receive this present, as he had always dreamed of possessing such a beautiful item. The superior officer was somewhat shocked that his subordinate decided to obtain property by the sea, as he was certain the latter despised such a location. When the servants began unloading Carcel's belongings, his wife was astonished by the amount of the soldier's possessions. There seemed to be little space for her own clothes, or even for herself. Of course, it was normal, as soldiers rarely reside with their wives at their duty stations, but the girl found it saddening. The Lord recalled overhearing his comrades discussing how they improved their marital relationships by relocating their women to port cities. The housekeeper of the residence turned out to be a welcoming and very cheerful woman, who promised to do everything for the comfort of the lady in her new abode. She even suggested to Anise to get rid of the items in the house that she disliked, hinting that everything equally belonged to both her and her spouse. Upon inspecting the house, it turned out there was also a room for playing billiards and other games favored by aristocrats. There, the man spent most of his time alone, occasionally inviting some of his friends from service. Afterwards, he showed the main protagonist their shared bedroom, which appeared spacious and filled with light. From the windows, a beautiful view of flower beds opened up, and the bed was adorned with soft bed linen. This made the girl feel somewhat flustered, as she actually liked it there, especially the view from the terrace of the seascape. The housekeeper showed the lady the library of Carcel, which he seldom used, so this space would now mostly belong to Anise. The reading room also offered a splendid view, leaving the Duke's daughter far more delighted with this place than one might assume. By the evening, when the garden was lit up with lights, the marital couple settled on their cozy terrace to have a conversation. In her usual manner, the main protagonist engaged in lighthearted sarcasm, which no longer repelled the young man. Regardless, the girl had a rather pleasant impression of this place, as her expectations were far worse. The city did not have the clamor of fishermen or numerous boats that belonged to them. Instead, it proved to be a quiet and cozy place to live. Anise showed a painting depicting the port of Seville, which was not far from there, and asked to dispose of the canvas from the house. In the morning, the main protagonist woke up in her husband's embrace, making it somewhat difficult for her to breathe due to his strong hold. She did not remember how she ended up on the bed. Her last memory was of sitting by the window. Impure thoughts flooded the girl's mind, and when she opened the Bible, she could not resist falling asleep. Anise was uncertain about the duration it would take for her spouse to seek another woman on the side, but she was convinced it would happen. The Duke's daughter felt the cool sea breeze on her skin from the open window and heard the sound of the waves, just like in Seville. When the main protagonist woke up after her second climax, now at the age of 6, she was shocked. Since then, Seville had become a place that evoked dreadful memories for the girl and turned into a true nightmare. For many years, she held resentment towards her brother and couldn't even explain the reason for this aggression towards him. From the age of 16 to 20, the period when she lived with her beloved from her previous life, the memories never left the girl. Now, lying in the embrace of another person, she did not dream of being close to the artist again. Instead, she coolly reflected on the past times. In this life, there was no place for events from the past, and therefore, Anise decided to wake her spouse as morning had come. Carcel arrived at work with a radiant smile, which greatly surprised his colleagues who expected him to be upset or even teary-eyed after the wedding. They all pondered for a long time about the motives behind this expression on his face and whether the young man's intentions were sincere at that moment. Carcel tried to quell others' interest in his personal life by offering simple and concise answers to their questions. The conversation then shifted to the man's wife, who looked stunning at the wedding, and some of the guests had noticed it since they were invited to the celebration. Upon opening the door to his office, the man saw numerous flowers and letters with congratulations from former lovers. His assistant wanted to ask him something, but the man dismissed him, not wanting to see anyone. He burned the letters, contemplating the jealousy that arose in him when others discussed his wife. Anise sat, partaking of a biscuit, whilst she listened to the disquieting murmurs of her servant, who spoke of the concern among the household staff regarding their mistress. After all, she spent her entire days at home, seemingly indifferent to any pursuits. Naturally, the young lady couldn't be with child, but she remained idle, indulging solely in eating and slumber. The servants fretted over her condition, as she had arrived from afar and knew no one else there. This is why they were so troubled. Perhaps their mistress had fallen into a melancholic state. Lately, Anise had been idle, no doubt, but did she genuinely resemble a person devoid of purpose? Comparing herself to her newlywed husband, who was industrious to a fault every morning, she felt like the most indolent of creatures. Presently, the Countess led such a quiet life that she seemed to have forgotten everything. In her former life, she had busied herself endlessly. She scarcely had any duties, as far as the servants were concerned, so Anise never pondered it. In her second life, she had been impoverished and couldn't afford servants. But this time, everything was different. The young lady required evidence to prepare for an elegant separation. Raoul stood near his mistress, gazing at the modest estate. It was so diminutive that her luggage barely fit inside. Initially, it was planned to divide it into 5 trips, but Anise persuaded her subordinate otherwise, as the estate scarcely accommodated Carcel's belongings. Initially, Raoul had been a faithful servant to Anise, whom she had brought to the palace to employ as a servant. However, in her now restricted circle, he was merely another individual. In her previous life, Raoul had been a street orphan she had rescued and left to work for her until the day of her demise. But in her present life, his rescue had been a calculated move, as Anise believed that Raoul might be of use to her someday. Yet, as it turned out, Raoul offered little benefit. Eventually, the young lady disregarded him, but with his pleasant appearance and tall stature, he managed to become a valet at a young age. Serving the nobility directly, Raoul gleaned their secrets and relayed them to Anise. He scrutinized the other servants to ensure Anise had everything she needed. When she, between the ages of 16 and 20, grew weary from her memories of Emiliano and the child, Raul and Juana did everything in their power to ensure she remained fed and alive. Now, Raul gazed upon the incredibly small estate and couldn't fathom how his mistress could live in such a place. Certainly, many people must dream of living in such a house, but those people should be in Raul's position, not his mistress's. Raul was very concerned and doubted Inez's reassuring words. He couldn't comprehend how the current situation could be satisfactory for a woman who insisted on donning a new dress every day. In conversation, Raul mentioned that Inez had promised to take him with her when she got married. However, the young lady couldn't hire even more servants at the estate, and she should be grateful for maintaining such a good condition of the estate, designed for officers on duty. Nevertheless, according to her loyal subject, the young lady should have simply let the lieutenant play the role of a destitute officer in solitude and return to Esposa herself. In her first life, Inez had used Raul as a slave, never recalling what had become of him in the second life. Now, she allowed him to live on his own, yet Raul remained unchanged. He continued to behave like a loyal dog, waiting to be called by name. While the young lady conversed with Raul, Carcel observed them from the side and decided to interrupt them at one point. Inez hadn't expected his return so soon. She hadn't even prepared anything. Although she wasn't the one preparing their meals, she at least pretended to be doing something. As the butler helped Carcel change, Inez noticed that his gaze was nearly identical to Aranda's. Even though Aranda was one thing, Inez couldn't ignore the butler's gaze. She couldn't be an indolent wife. There was a time when she grew tired of hearing Carcel's name. After the unceasing praises of his appearance from the women, they claimed that his greatest asset was not his handsome face, but rather his chest and back, into which so much effort had been invested. Inez remembered the times when she lay in the salon constantly, which had been such a delight for her. But those days were gone, and only the protagonists of that story remained. There was no more gossip about Inez and Carcel as a couple. Here in Castel, they were the only ones. Deep in thought, Inez noticed that Carcel was changing on his own and came to the conclusion that, apparently, in Mendoza, her husband had lived the same life without aristocratic airs. She approached him, offering her assistance. However, Carcel warned her that if she joined him, the removal of his trousers wouldn't be the end of it. Noticing that the young lady hadn't left after those words, Carcel pondered that she wanted to make amends for not preparing dinner. Inez wanted to apologize for not preparing dinner, as it was such a straightforward task that she didn't want to fail at it. Carcel gazed at his wife with a longing look and, approaching her, smiled enchantingly. He almost lost control of his desires, gazing at his wife. He had never once told her that he would pounce on her, so why did she always swiftly evade him? Inez was about to leave, but Carcel took her by the hand and embraced her around the waist. While Carcel made advances towards his spouse, their chambermaid noticed them and became slightly alarmed. Inez, however, donned a feigned smile, which greatly surprised Carcel. When the chambermaid left, he inquired about the nature of that smile. The young lady, gazing earnestly at her husband, advised him to mature since he was, after all, already married. In his own home, he should at least observe decorum. The spouses engaged in an argument as they walked through the estate's corridors. However, Inez stopped and looked in the direction where she noticed Raul approaching. Encountering Raul, Inez gently rebuffed her husband and approached her protege. Raul was, to her, virtually a member of the family. Therefore, coming across him was akin to coming across Lucien's gaze while being in the arms of another man. Inez inquired of Raul if he had dined, and he responded to his mistress that he would dine after her and her husband. Carcel observed all of this from the sidelines. Every time Raul was nearby, Inez seemed to abruptly cease noticing anything else. Carcel, it seems, harbored a touch of jealousy toward his wife's regard for the servant. Listening to his wife's explanations, Carcel remarked that she spoke as if Raul were akin to a puppy raised in her childhood home. While sharing a meal with his wife, Carcel appeared dissatisfied. The lady too frequently incorporated various forms of canine references into her lexicon, using them as the foundation. However, with Raul, everything was different, and, without knowing why, Carcel felt irritation. He thought that, perhaps, today's guest simply did not suit his taste. However, Raul was not a guest. He was the steward of Valstina and had arrived solely to deliver Inez's belongings, as the lady had previously mentioned. But this story is not intended for Carcel's ears. Observing the countenance of the lady and listening to her narrative, Carcel seemed to perceive her dissatisfaction with his early return that day. It appeared to him that the lady was displeased, as he had interrupted the reunion of old friends. Inez did not deny that she, along with Raul and Juana, had always protected her quite zealously. Although Carcel believed that he had never laid eyes on Raoul, in contrast to Juana, the lady remarked that Carcel might simply not remember Raoul, even if they had crossed paths. Presumably, this was because Carcel did not deem him sufficiently intrusive to capture his attention. To Carcel's surprise, Raoul was remarkably experienced, intelligent, and attuned to the needs of the nobility. A lady alluded to the notion that the finest servants were those who remained least conspicuous to individuals of great affluence. And once the discussion turned to Raoul, Inez hoped that Carcel would not object if she were to engage in further conversation with him after dinner. Carcel did not comprehend why the lady needed to seek his permission in this matter. Nevertheless, Raoul was, after all, a man, and Carcel was her husband. The lady had nothing to conceal, for Raoul was merely a servant of the Valstina household. However, since their meeting would occur at such a late hour, and Carcel had mentioned not recalling Raoul, the lady had a penchant for delving into details. It is advisable for her husband to bear this in mind in the future. When Inez concluded her explanation, Carcel gently covered his mouth with his hand, smiling, and blushed slightly. Carcel knew that he could not compare to Raoul. Nevertheless, Raoul's refinement and pleasing appearance were qualities that the nobility would likely deem advantageous. Yet, despite possessing an array of undeniable virtues, the valet could not tempt Inez. Inez was concerned solely with appearances, which is why she became Inez Escalante. At the age of 6, she pointed her finger at Carcel, and from that very moment, it became as clear as day that her standards regarding appearances were extraordinarily high. Inez was filled with determination to secure the most attractive man for herself. Perhaps their wedding night was her first, but the feeling that Inez was inexperienced in matters of men did not arise at all. Despite her pretense of being unyielding, there was nothing she could hide. Yet, the first night proved exceedingly protracted. Carcel continued to feel exceedingly guilty because he could not broach this topic. It did not matter to him how many men the lady had in her past, be it 10 or even 20. 10 would be better than 1, and 20 even better than 10. But 1, the worst possible number. He surmised that it was one man who had breached her defenses. Carcel was perturbed, merely by being near Inez, as he wondered if he could ever prevail. However, when he contemplated the notion of defeating the valet, the brazenness with which his lips pronounced Inez's name undoubtedly stemmed from the distant times when they were together. Meanwhile, during the past 17 years between Carcel and Inez, there had been nothing. Once, Inez exposed only foul emotions in his dreams. For a time, Carcel had forgotten about them, but now those wretched feelings were resurfacing. Regardless of what he felt, Inez was with him. He knew that he was her epitome, Carcel Escalante. He was aware of this, but he still fretted. One of the maids was brushing Inez's hair and, accidentally, she tugged too hard, causing the comb to become entangled in her dark locks. Inez was aware of the difficulties in brushing her hair as it was still somewhat damp. However, the maid was uncertain how to handle the situation as the comb remained entangled and began to panic. At that moment, Inez dispatched the maid to attend to other duties and resolved to deal with the unruly hair herself. When the maid departed, Carcel entered his wife's chamber. Upon entering the room, Carcel noticed the comb entangled in his wife's hair and could not fathom what had occurred. Inez had previously mentioned hiring a maid. However, since they would only stay in Kalstel for a short time, he had not deemed it necessary. There was no room in their residence to accommodate new servants. The servants and the gardener already occupied a separate cottage. Carcel suggested to Inez that they release some of the servants to hire a personal maid for her. However, when the matter of the cook was raised, he insisted that he should not be released. For him, preparing meat was the most crucial element of his diet. Approaching his wife, Carcel gathered her hair and began to comb it himself. However, it did not go quite as he had hoped, and then he realized that it would indeed be better for them to hire a personal maid or invite Juana there. However, the latter option was impossible as Juana was getting married. When Carcel suggested moving Juana's family to their estate, Inez finally reminded him that he had forgotten how small the house they were currently living in was. Inez never failed to be deeply impressed by her husband's countenance. Even when he did something amusing, he managed to appear more endearing than pitiable. Nevertheless, her taste in men had always left much to be desired. In her previous life, she had chosen a filthy scoundrel who was utterly unsuitable as a husband. And in her second life, her choice fell upon a poor orphan who worked as a humble assistant to an artist. As the Oscar's status proved insufficient to redeem his utterly debauched lifestyle, so did Emiliana's love and devotion fall short in compensating for the miserable reality. Carcel adeptly managed the coiffure of his spouse much quicker than the maid. The lady acknowledged his considerable skills. He then claimed his reward. Initially, the lady did not comprehend his desires, but soon he leaned in, whispering into her ear, and, with one hand, fondly caressed her breast, placing the other on her waist. Carcel, discreetly to an ease, swiftly bared her shoulders, planting a trail of kisses descending to her bosom, and began to caress her form. However, the lady entreated the gentleman to desist, as the environment made her uncomfortable. Her spouse wished to conduct this in front of the mirror, believing that it greatly appealed to Inez, despite her resistance. Carcel embraced Inez around her waist, drawing her close, and whispered in her ear that she should also witness how passionately he longed for her. The lady stated that it was his duty to claim her, and for her to be taken, and they could merely fulfill what was expected. So why, Inez wondered, had she become so aroused? Carcel requested an answer. After that night, something had undoubtedly transpired in Carcel's mind. Otherwise, he had truly lost his mind. Inez simply could not fathom what so captivated him about her. They had cast aside the formalities that were to be observed in Mendos. Yet the lady continued to don the same dull black attire, not even applying a touch of makeup. Did she not think her current appearance might arouse a man's interest? Until Inez fell under Carcel's spell, their collaboration had been exclusively for the purpose of executing a plan. The charade was for the lady to pretend desperately desiring this marriage, despite Carcel's reluctance. She had wed practically instantaneously, although the proposal had been untimely. For such a woman, the honeymoon was meant to be a dream come true, was it not? Inez was convinced that the decision to sleep with Carcel whenever he desired was the correct one. Now, she had to gradually decrease their contacts. The plan had always entailed her demanding to sleep with her and receiving a refusal. Their marriage would undoubtedly culminate in divorce. Then, Inez would finally attain her freedom. At the end of this life, true death awaited her. Frequently, servants were involved in divorce cases, but it was crucial for them not to appear bought off. There were instances when both the husband and the wife hastily bribed the servants to obtain the required testimony in court. Some servants acted shrewdly, while others were less adept. One mistake by a servant could affect the court's judgment, considering all testimony to be tainted. Therefore, it was important to ensure that the testimony appeared credible. There was another facet to the issue of paid servants, when one party had paid the servant but received testimony of an entirely different nature. Ultimately, the servant had violated the terms of the deal and betrayed the employer. Such a situation could arise if the servant harbored hatred for the employer, or had been a victim of unfair treatment in the past. People tended to see only the favorable aspects of someone they liked, regardless of the objective reality. An exemplary case of this was the Duchess Kate's affair. She had always been so kind that her reputation was nearly impeccable. Consequently, despite clear evidence of adultery by both her and her spouse, the court's decision in favor of the Duchess was more favorable. All this, the teacher explained to the 10-year-old Inez. The lady gleaned from it that to earn a favorable opinion from others, she needed to establish a good reputation over a considerable period of time. When establishing a reputation over an extended period of time, servants should never discover that they are being bribed. In fact, trying to bribe them is entirely unnecessary. Sometimes, merely showing them favor is enough. It is challenging not to feel benevolence toward those who exhibit great generosity. In this world, money can touch the heart. It would be best to find out how much they earn. However, even if Inez were to discover this, it would not be of much use to her. But, of course, she knew that poverty was the reality. After all, life with Emiliana was her immediate definition. Yet, that alone was not enough for Inez to genuinely comprehend the lives of common folks. When they fled, they occasionally sold any available precious items and paintings that Inez had taken from her home, occasionally fetching substantial sums of money. However, at that time, the lady did not have a profound understanding of the actual value of these things and often sold them for a pittance. Emiliano simply agreed to all her foolish decisions. They were hopeless romantics. During this time, Inez held a paper and a quill, asking the steward about the whereabouts of the servants. Aronda inquired with a touch of concern why Inez was inquiring about this, and the lady admitted that she had been too inattentive upon finding herself in this new and strange place. Therefore, she felt lonely. Experiencing this emotion, the lady had wasted her days, only to realize that she had shut her heart to everyone around her. Until now, Inez had never genuinely comprehended how much Alfonso and Aronda cared for her. Nevertheless, despite her very close rapport with Aronda, Inez viewed her relationship with the steward with a modicum of suspicion. Whenever their eyes met, the steward struck her as an exceedingly uncompromising individual. He could eventually grow disillusioned with her, as she had been fairly idle for some time. She remained oblivious to the thoughts harbored by the gentleman, yet the achievement of their grand plan required a considerable span of time. Upon Carcel's return to the estate, he paused at the threshold, observing the servants bustling to and fro through the rooms. He was utterly perplexed, unsure if something extraordinary was transpiring. Soon, he noted Anise coming toward him with an air of contentment. She appeared different from her usual self, more like an ordinary wife, relishing the reunion with her husband. Her voice sounded tender, as if her soul had been possessed by a wayward spirit. Anise also conducted herself as though she were playing a role in a theatrical performance. The commotion stemmed from the estate being crammed with belongings, which Anise sought to expediently organize. Upon her arrival in Kalstalu, Anise had been exceedingly fatigued, appearing as though she had savored the fruits of life. Carcel found this utterly endearing. However, in the morning, an unexpected idea occurred to Anise. She desired to turn the house upside down. The estate was in utter disarray, cluttered with an excess of belongings. Consequently, Anise resolved to restore order with the assistance of the servants. She smiled and took her husband's hand. Anise had never compelled herself to smile at anyone, not even the royal family, as a child. She had always been indifferent to everything. Therefore, this moment, brimming with kindness, was profoundly unusual. Carcel noticed that Anise particularly reveled in issuing commands, though such behavior was characteristic of all nobles. He recalled Oscar, speculating that he might have suited Anise better. However, as soon as this thought entered his mind, his countenance darkened. Anise had not even employed her perfume that day. Today, she conducted herself like a genuine aristocrat, a stark departure from her usual self. Carcel mused whether his wife had reverted to recollections of the previous night they had spent together, sitting before the mirror. The day felt interminable, and the approach of night seemed distant. Anise smiled and looked at her husband, paying attention to the servants who toiled tirelessly despite their profound fatigue. It was only then that Carcel finally comprehended the intent behind his spouse's actions. One thing was clear: Anise had yet to turn her attention to him. Her benevolence was directed solely toward the servants. The attention she had recently displayed was a performance for them. Carcel was so deeply lost in thought that he failed to notice how long he had been gazing at Anise without diverting his gaze. The steward informed him of this fact. Anise inquired about his stance on replacing the fence surrounding the estate. Carcel regarded her with curiosity and offered his apologies while inquiring about the rationale behind her actions. He indeed valued her efforts but remained unaware of what had precipitated this abrupt change in her behavior. Anise elucidated that she was doing it to enable Carcel to host guests in their estate. She had invited Almanar for a luncheon, but he appeared discomfited, for Carcel's gaze bore into him menacingly. The man shrank beneath the lieutenant's scrutiny, praying for his release. Jose Almanara, for the third son of the Count Almanara, he proved to be remarkably unassuming, modest, and naturally timid. Nevertheless, in Anise's second life, he almost became her stepson. The heroine set aside the dining utensils and turned her attention to her guest. He was not particularly pleased with the attention directed towards him, for it had ignited disputes among the young people. Jose felt immense pressure, both from Anise and his superior, regardless of their relationship's quality. In Jose's opinion, the spouses were peculiar. Their argument resembled that of an adult lecturing a child. Observing the couple from the sidelines, Almanara realized that Anise was vastly different from the image painted by rumors. She was nothing like the somber individual compared to a raven. In truth, the Countess was an incredible beauty with a kind disposition. Though compelled to utilize his entire vacation this year, Jose had no regrets. After all, when else would an opportunity arise to receive apologies from Lieutenant Carcel? Not to mention the fact that Anise, a splendid woman. All in all, the day had proven to be quite fruitful for Almanara. The protagonist's aunt, Empress Kitana, embodied pure ambition. His father, who had set several significant goals for himself and worked his whole life to attain them, struggled to keep up with his sister. As it later became evident, the Empress feared that the main character, born into an equally noble family, might overshadow her in the eyes of all, just as she had done to others and herself. Therefore, although the Empress despised watching the heir prince following Anise, she could not allow her to join another family, even if it meant assigning the detested Raven the status of Oscar's wife. However, the outcome was that the girl, who was not good enough for the heir prince but far too good to part with, became the niece of the Empress, which proved to be rather convenient. Anise no longer stood in the way. It was only necessary to use her appropriately. The Empress had taken up a hobby, sending lists of events that the main characters were expected to attend. While Anise declined most invitations, except those that came directly from the Empress, Carcel attended all the functions, which only served to emphasize the absence of the lady beside him. According to the Empress, this signified the support of the Duke of Valstina and the Crown Prince and demonstrated the greatest marital union. It was a way to remind the Duke that there was no turning back. Kitana knew the Duke intended to reclaim his daughter, given the chance, which was precisely why she was so adamant about imprinting the Escalante name on Anise by any means necessary. Now, once again contemplating this matter, Carcel realized how exhausting life must be under the control of so many people. Lost in thought, the lieutenant watched his wife bid farewell to the guest while engaging in a captivating conversation, during which Anise offered to become a close friend of Jose's spouse. Finally, the man informed the lady that, seeing the happy lieutenant, his comrades had begun to reconsider whether matrimony was as bad as they thought. As she discussed her plans to change the estate's environment with the guest, Anise thought it would be good to build an orangery with a gaming table so her husband could play with his friends, rather than playing alone, staring at the wall. Carcel seemed to have never been acquainted with anyone closely, perhaps because he had come to understand that he was magnificent in and of himself. It might have been difficult for others to accept, but Anise hoped that her husband would be understood, as he truly was quite remarkable. Jose Carcel overheard every word of his wife's conversation. Both of them treated him as if he had no communication skills. For the lieutenant, this was incredibly humiliating. But for some reason, Anise's request to show understanding to the lad was received as though she cared for him as her man. Carcel appreciated this. With the help of her husband's closest acquaintance, the heroine, unfortunately, confirmed that the disorderly lifestyle the man had led in Mendoza had remained there. Jose Almenara did not resemble a man capable of lying to his superior's spouse. During this dinner, the girl did not discover much. Perhaps the problem lay in Carcel's inability to meet other women in Kalstal. But it was not time to be disappointed yet. If Carcel lacked such an opportunity, the heroine would simply create it herself. While the spouses were engaged in amorous activities, Carcel observed that his dearest wife was preoccupied with thoughts beyond him during the process. This prompted a surge of jealousy within him, as he suspected Anise's thoughts were fixed on Jose Almenara. Indeed, that was partially the case, though this man was merely a facet of the young lady's grand design, and it never occurred to her to dwell on the topic her husband suspected. As Carcel was already on the brink of irrationality without jealousy, the Countess decided to refrain from further pressuring her spouse, for her sole purpose was to ensure that a few harmless birds would carry the news of Carcel, enabling Anise to employ it as evidence in their impending divorce. Nevertheless, Anise still harbored a desire for Carcel to reconcile with all. She couldn't discern the cause of this sentiment. In Ortega, marital infidelity is not regarded as a vice. Its existence may be held against you in court, but, in all other cases, it is scarcely considered significant. Among the nobility, those who remain faithful and do not engage in extramarital affairs are considered old-fashioned. Denise had no intention of causing any harm, and thus neither society nor her husband, Carcel, were perturbed by her actions. She simply intended to use her husband for a while until she could restore his former life. Furthermore, in his initial life, after refusing to marry, Carcel failed to attain a title. Hence, when comparing his newfound liberty, it appeared to be truly impeccable. Therefore, the young lady desired her husband to refrain from interfering with her plans and to calmly adhere to them. Anise was feeling quite fatigued from her night with her husband. Carcel had extracted every drop of energy from her, prompting her to ponder if he had been similarly inclined with his paramours in the past. However, no rumors to that effect had surfaced, making it impossible for Anise to arrive at a definitive conclusion. When the girl noticed a breakfast tray on her bed, she was slightly disconcerted, as she suspected that servants might have entered the room while she slept. However, this was not the case. The breakfast in bed was brought by Carcel, who was concerned about her well-being since she had not awakened for a long time, and he sought to make amends with his wife. Complaining to her spouse about his nocturnal behavior, the young lady noticed a plate of breakfast prepared by Carcel on the tray. Ortegan men never partake of breakfast in the bedroom unless they are bedridden or on their deathbed. Carcel had tormented Anise during the night, but it was not deliberate. He had missed his training that day and usually wore himself out before coming home. Upon learning of this, Anise realized that her husband had been attempting to be restrained throughout the previous evening and at all other times. Frustrated by the thought of losing to the protagonist in terms of endurance, the young lady attempted to bolster her pride, if only by having breakfast without his assistance. However, even then, he managed to slip a piece of pastry into her mouth during a heated argument, accompanying it with a suggestive remark, leaving Anise flustered. To Carcel, his wife seemed more akin to a cat than a human. Inez believed that if she and Carcel engaged in amorous activities every night, the need to wait for the prospect of having a child would be obviated. The young lady suggested to her spouse to select the most suitable days for conception, but he insisted that if they indulged in their passions every day, the chance of conceiving a child would be considerably higher. Amid their dispute, Carcel asked Inez to adjust his collar, and when she fulfilled his request, he tenderly kissed her forehead, expressing gratitude for her assistance, which greatly surprised his wife. Inez was dissatisfied with the state of her relationship with Carcel. Raoul delivered a letter from Inez's mother and remarked on how emaciated she had become. Of course, this was attributed to her nightly exertions. Ever since she received news in her previous life from her mother regarding her attempted suicide, Inez had been setting fire to any letters she received. In her first life, the Countess's mother tormented her own children with various neuroses, and when Inez experienced a miscarriage with the Crown Prince, the woman turned to insults. In her present life, observing how her daughter resisted the impact exerted upon her, the woman was horrified and disciplined the main character through letters, even when they resided in the same castle. Despite all of this, Inez's mother could not completely disown her daughter, as she continued to love her in her own way. When Inez learned this truth, she was utterly drained and hence ceased her resistance. She could not believe that her aversion to having children stemmed from a mere letter. However, it was a path she could not reverse. As before, Inez instructed Raoul to burn the letter, for she had no intention of writing a response to her mother. Furthermore, her faithful subordinate had already reported everything to her. Recently, Raoul had visited Carcel's homeland, and Inez inquired about its condition. The valet reported that the castle appeared quite deserted, and it seemed that the Duchess held little affection for it. Most of her time was spent in Mendoza. The Duchess of Escalante was a noblewoman with a demure smile and a rather meek disposition. In Inez's previous life, they often crossed paths by chance, but noteworthy interactions between them were scarce. The younger brother of the main character, after graduating from the military academy, would spend his entire life moving back and forth between posts in Mendoza and their home. Thus, as long as Inez resided in Esposa, he naturally came under her supervision. Upon returning home in the evening, Carcel received news from his wife regarding the appointment of Raoul as the chamberlain in their estate. Alfonso, the aging steward, still served as the valet. Carcel was not particularly fond of this scheme. Was Raoul not too young for such a position? Despite Carcel's evident displeasure, Raoul behaved as if he did not see or hear him. Despite her husband's protests, Inez had no intention of retracting her decision. However, Lieutenant Carcel, occasionally observing the interactions between his wife and her protégé, felt intense jealousy and discontent. He could not help himself, but, for the sake of his wife, he eventually acquiesced to her choice and welcomed Raoul into the ranks of their estate's servants. Raoul served Carcel well, and he enjoyed it, but it also further irritated the lieutenant. After all, Raoul placed Inez above everything and occasionally displayed insubordination to Carcel as his master. Therefore, the main character decided that it would not hurt to observe the vulnerabilities of the astute valet in his wife's presence, and he made this request to his steward. The lieutenant desired to be informed about everything that Raoul did, especially when he was in the company of Inez. Alfonso immediately noticed that his master was jealous of his wife's attachment to the valet. It struck him as somewhat amusing, but he still did not refuse his master's request. The heroine, along with her faithful attendant, set off to choose wine for the reception. However, the weather unexpectedly deteriorated. While Inez and Raoul sat in the carriage, he puzzled over why the lieutenant had not, despite his newlywed wife living in a new place for several months, yet introduced her to the renowned wine shop. Carcel had indeed intended to take his wife there, but she always seemed as if she had no desire to leave the estate's walls. So, the young man endeavored to avoid irritating her for some time. During their conversation, Raoul noted for himself that, despite his concerns, Inez, while living with her spouse, appeared much more at ease than during her time in Veilstein. And it occurred to him that Lieutenant Carcel had a hand in this, although his status was not as high as that of the Crown Prince, whom the main character had rejected at an early stage. Being the eldest son of House Escalante, Carcel represented an excellent candidate for a husband, not to mention that even Raoul, a man, could appreciate his good looks. And, despite his muscular build and striking physique, when it came to his wife, the protagonist surprisingly revealed his tender side. His passion, interest, and kindness toward his spouse overflowed. Carcel could be an ideal as long as his old habits did not resurface. However, being informed, Raoul could not help but remain vigilant. Meanwhile, as Carcel ordered, Raoul was being monitored. After the coachman had taken his mistress and her valet to the wine shop and brought them back to the estate, he reported to the steward about all the interactions observed between Anise and Raoul. The steward assigned the surveillance task to some of the servants, but only the maid proved reasonably capable of providing the necessary information. On the day of the reception, Anise was receiving the wives of Carcel's colleagues, who shared many interesting tidbits with her. Meanwhile, he was spending time with his fellow officers. Everyone was occupied with their affairs. In her past life as a crown princess, the main character would have laughed if someone had referred to the event that took place in the estate of Escalante that day as small in scale. The location was even worse, except for those who came from sufficiently important families to become high-ranking officers. Guests at the reception were far from being part of Mendoza's high society. Nonetheless, all the guests at that reception were equally less corrupted than those immersed in the vanity of Mendoza's city. The couple's estate was neither a palace nor Mendoza, but perhaps the contentment Anise sought in life was right there, in that small and cozy garden. As she strolled around the estate, Anise spotted Raoul, who continued to extol his mistress to Marquise Barker. Upon seeing this woman, Anise realized that she needed to rescue her valet, as he could soon find himself in the Marquise's bed. The heroine greeted her guest and offered to take a walk through the estate, but only after gathering all the ladies. Anise wished to present them with a small gift. While the young woman conducted a tour of the estate, she and her guests stopped in the library. While the ladies enthusiastically praised the changes made by the heroine, Anise modestly observed from the sidelines. Then, at one point, she noticed the somber, slightly inebriated Lady Salvator. Anise guided her guest to a chair, and that was when Senora asked if Anise knew that the estate they were currently in did not originally belong to Carcel. Senora Salvator was about to inform Anise that the estate originally did not belong to her spouse. However, Anise was more concerned about the fact that the woman was inebriated and might soil her carpet, which she had recently replaced. Salvator continued to deny that she was intoxicated. She claimed that her husband was to blame for her alcoholism since he corrupted women. This is why none of his marriages have lasted long enough. Although in her current life, the heroine had never even tasted alcohol, she still vividly remembered the years of suffering from addiction in her past life when she would drink in the morning, just after getting out of bed, and remain inebriated until bedtime. Salvator was in despair. She envied the wives who could escape from her husband. However, she believed that if she didn't succeed in escaping this time, she would either die or end up killing her husband. Out of kindness, Anise advised the woman to file for divorce, but Salvator vehemently refused because divorce was intended for people like her husband, not for people like her and ladies such as Anise who were unaware of life's hardships. Upon hearing this rebuke from the woman, Anise recalled what she had been through. The young woman understood better than anyone. Midway through the conversation, Carcel joined Anise. She asked her husband where Lieutenant Salvator, who was the spouse of Senora, was. Carcel then said that the lieutenant was in the same condition as the woman. When Carcel decided to accompany Senora Salvator to her spouse, the woman stumbled and almost fell. However, Carcel firmly supported her. Anise was not pleased with this, and she teasingly provoked her husband a bit. Upon realizing that his wife had finally shown some jealousy toward him, he lifted Senora Salvator over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. This was observed by the other ladies, and as soon as Carcel left, the women approached Anise with admiring exclamations. When Anise and Carcel were finally alone, he decided to clarify to his wife that, in his understanding, Senora Salvator was far from attractive. For Anise, this was the silliest justification, as who could find anyone attractive if Carcel gazed at his own reflection in the mirror every single day, which was incredibly handsome. However, Carcel shattered Anise's illusion about him by stating that it was his spouse who was attractive. Perhaps she was the only woman he found attractive. For the same reason, Carcel did not find any pleasure in escorting that lady. Slightly embarrassed, the hero told his wife that on that day, he had only seen one lovely woman, Anise, and no one else. Not just on that day, but every other day as well. If the young lady thought that her husband would derive pleasure from a drunken woman falling onto him in front of his wife, she clearly did not know him. Then, Anise asked if perhaps Lieutenant Salvator would have been happier if it had happened somewhere she couldn't see, as in the past. This led to a minor dispute between the spouses. Anise decided to caress her husband's cheek, and he, biting her, said that she didn't even deserve the right to be upset with him. The young woman told Carcel that the only thing she wanted from him was for him to always remain as he was, preserving his flawless face in its original state, and that way, any fault for the incident at this reception would be smoothed over. Inez stated that she would never leave Carcel first, no matter how unattractive his face became over time. A little later, Carcel contemplated Inez's words, thinking that her words about not leaving him even if he became slightly less handsome might have merit. However, his thoughts were interrupted when Raul burst into the room and said that Senor Salvador was furious because he had lost something in the newlyweds' estate. Despite not drinking alcohol, Raul often had such quirks. Fearing the consequences, Carcel advised Raul to simply give something to Senora Salvador and let her servant go. Raul couldn't understand why they should cater to a drunkard's behavior if it's only about the habits of a drunk. Explaining the truth to him would give Carcel even more of a headache, and Senor Salvador might have beaten his servant in anger. After those words, Raul frowned and told Carcel that he hadn't yet informed his lady about how her husband had been spying on her. On the reception day, the main protagonist stood on the terrace with some of the ladies who had been invited to the gathering. As they gazed upon the incredibly picturesque view that unfolded at sunset, they finally understood why Carcel had exchanged his grand residence near the headquarters for this unremarkable, diminutive estate, which required a bit of a struggle to acquire. Inez, while listening to the arguments of her guests, could not believe that her husband was capable of something so naive and foolish for her sake. At that moment, the main hero approached them with one of the officers who was admiring the organization of the armory within the modest estate, as well as the gun that Inez had gifted her husband in honor of their wedding. Raul cast a dark gaze at the lieutenant. They discussed the surveillance established by Carcel on Inez. However, the man only smirked in response to the valet's arguments. During their brief conversation, Raul realized that the surveillance was actually being conducted on him, as the lieutenant was consumed by jealousy. Despite Raul's reasoning, he could not rid himself of this persistent feeling of possessiveness towards Inez. Raul decided to take advantage of this situation and earnestly requested Carcel not to harm his mistress and to love Inez wholeheartedly. Afterward, Raul immediately went to report to his mistress, and she ordered surveillance on her husband. Carcel was not to Raul's liking, but the valet was quite astute and understood that there wouldn't be a better candidate to be his mistress's spouse. He proposed that Inez make the most of her marriage and reap the maximum benefits from it. The main hero was not favored by Raul due to his lies and his past. However, Inez also lied to the lieutenant. Yet, in her servant's eyes, these two instances of deceit were entirely different. What Inez had experienced previously, almost driving her to madness, was an expression of her illness, while Carcel was simply insincere. Husband and wife both kept an eye on each other, but they had different motives for their actions. From Raul's reports, Inez learned that her spouse was a highly respectable officer who did nothing but shuttle between home and the headquarters. In general, there was nothing particularly intriguing for the young lady. Raul spoke of Carcel as an opportunity for Inez, but the young lady intended to act in a manner directly opposed to what her valet hoped for. Nonetheless, she would certainly derive some benefit from it. After their wedding, the lieutenant underwent a significant transformation, but the heroine hoped that he would eventually revert to his former self. Subsequently, Raul continued his report about Senior Lieutenant Munoz. This man had taken a mistress while his wife was away from the estate, deceiving the poor girl into believing he would make her his wife. For the sake of his only daughter, the mistress's father paid off all of Senior Lieutenant Munoz's debts, depleting his savings. However, when his wife returned, the father and daughter realized they had been deceived and could do nothing to rectify the situation. Inez, armed with this information, wished to help as many women as possible who had suffered a fate similar to her own. 2 weeks later, the main characters visited the hunting grounds on the outskirts of the naval port. Inez sipped tea in the company of several ladies, and shortly thereafter, they heard a gunshot in the forests. The women began to speculate on who could have pulled the trigger, following the sound of the gunshot. While the ladies surrounding Inez speculated on who had pulled the trigger, the young lady immersed herself in reminiscences of her childhood. In the past, she and her elder brother had also gone hunting. As they strolled through the forest, her brother regaled her with tales of how to analyze the shots echoing through the woods, the cries of animals or birds, and the rustling of branches and leaves when a bird falls. From the information Inez had gleaned from her brother, she understood that the recent shot had been unsuccessful, as there were no sounds indicating a successful hit on the animal. Her brother commended her for her accurate analysis and extended his hand, inviting her to hunt for foxes. After her reverie, the main heroine directed her attention to her husband, who continued to shoot at everything in sight, never missing a single shot. It mildly vexed her, but the other senoras were thoroughly captivated. The women were delighted. Carcel, after making his final shot and gathering with the officers, joyfully approached Inez and embraced her tightly. The young lady was not particularly thrilled with this, but she felt a sliver of happiness. Lady Escalante maintained a rather frosty demeanor towards her spouse, yet the ladies continued to chatter about how deeply Inez loved her husband and how proud she was of him. Hearing the latter, Carcel, with eyes sparkling from delight, gazed at his wife. Inez was taken aback by the sight of her husband and nearly found herself falling for him. As the newlyweds were riding in their carriage on their way home, Inez suggested to her spouse that they attend a family mass in the chapel. Carcel was indifferent to the idea, but he believed that a family mass would be much more convenient for both of them and their servants. A family mass, a simple form of the service, involved inviting the parish priest to visit one's home and meet with the household members, sparing them the need to personally visit the chapel. In the Empire, the family mass was considered a highly significant event, so this practice was not overly common. However, if Inez and Carcel failed to attend the chapel for the mass, Carcel's superiors might be displeased. The main heroine was grateful to her husband for taking her reluctance to visit the chapel on this particular occasion into consideration. However, she did not wish to cause problems for her spouse with his superiors due to her. The main reason was that the young lady had no inkling of the central importance of the Mass in Council, an event attended by numerous ladies, and she missed the chance to help Carcel make the acquaintance of at least one woman. Although her spouse felt uncomfortable attending the chapel for the Mass, Inez insisted on it, as she did not want to burden him. A minor argument ensued on this topic, during which Carcel realized that his wife genuinely cared for him. Upon realizing this fact, he became overly excited and began making advances towards his wife right in the carriage. As for Inez, she had no inclination to rebuff Carcel to make him stop. In such a case, would an opportunity present itself for her in the chapel? As soon as Inez set foot on the chapel grounds, an incredibly beautiful lady rushed towards Carcel, capable of captivating the hearts of many men with just her smile and the flutter of her eyelashes. Upon seeing this lady, Inez understood that at the very first mass in the main chapel of Council, the opportunity she had long awaited had presented itself. This auspicious opportunity allowed Carcel to successfully seduce another woman. Inez rejected the proposal of marriage from the heir to the throne, shocking him with her declaration. The young boy vehemently implored his friend, refusing to accept her rejection, and showered Carcel, whom young Inez had set her sights on, with dirty words. The heir to the throne, Oscar, believed that Inez would not find happiness with Escalante due to his perpetual infidelity. However, the prince was unaware that he was just as unfaithful as Carcel, if not worse. After all, Carcel would only engage in extramarital affairs with women, whereas Oscar had betrayed Inez in a past life even with men. Unable to endure the screams of the heir to the throne any longer, the young main heroine implored him to cease causing her suffering. The prince, with anger in his voice, declared that things between him and Inez were far from over, and he departed, bumping into Enrique Osorno at the exit, who was 5 years older than the main heroine. This lad was the sole grandson of the Duke of Osorno. In the future, he would be an honorable man who would never betray his beloved wife. Consider this, Inez was genuinely disappointed that this lad wouldn't die young, leaving behind children. She felt as though she were sinning just by entertaining such thoughts. Nevertheless, one could not change the fact that in their empire, the most successful women were those who had gone through divorce, or whose husbands had passed away or disappeared. Women who were unattached to anything or anyone, capable of living independently. That was the only way to attain true freedom. Consequently, divorce was the main heroine's sole aim. Of course, it would be wonderful if she had no need to marry at all. However, such an option simply did not suit the daughter of the Valston family. Inez would bring shame upon her parents and her family. She would be relegated to the lowest rung of high society, and that would be quite painful. Furthermore, an unmarried woman was not allowed to make decisions about her own property, even in her later years. An Ortega woman had to marry in order to be treated as a fully grown individual, albeit only as the wife of some man. Inez didn't need an ordinary husband like Enrique. She required a man who would one day depart from her life through legal means, the granting of a title and property, a substantial pension, and the right to independence. No matter how foolish a man may be, he could obtain all of these once he reached the age of 17. However, for a woman to acquire similar benefits, she had to endure various hardships, from marriage to divorce, and even a possible severe loss. But at that moment, Inez had no other options. She needed someone appealing. She would rather marry a man who would pass away soon after the birth of their child. However, she had no intention of sacrificing someone for this purpose. One day, her husband would leave her of his own volition, a man with such a perfect countenance that he would become the object of desire for all women. Inez needed someone who would enable her to divorce easily. She needed the greatest ladies' man. That's why Inez chose Carcel Escalante as her husband. Meanwhile, while in the present Carcel occupied himself by foolishly avoiding other women, Inez observed a girl resembling an angel, and it turned out that she wasn't mistaken. The granddaughter of the lieutenant's mentor, Maria Noriega, was head over heels in love with the main hero and didn't hesitate to openly show her discontent and jealousy towards his spouse. Inez only grew happier from these glances, and during their small verbal dispute with Maria, Carcel became the man deserving of pity, as his wife and Maria both claimed that he was forced to marry Ileana. Maria made several attempts to convince the main hero to stay with her for a brief conversation, but the man repeatedly declined her lady. Unable to find another solution, she mentioned the health of her grandfather, Carcel's mentor. The young man couldn't refuse in the presence of his wife, so he had to agree to visit the Noriega estate and his mentor. The meeting was pleasant but also left the main hero with an unpleasant feeling. After all, his mentor stated that the young man was in love. Carcel didn't want to admit it, but he decided not to do anything about it for the time being, as it didn't have a significant impact on him. Carcel declined the carriage to quickly rid himself of the persistent Maria, and decided to first head to the headquarters. However, in the crowd, he noticed Raoul's distinctive figure. Carcel noticed the shadow of Raoul, who was keeping an eye on him, and he pondered that Raoul might be conducting surveillance out of his own caprice, as he takes pride in his loyalty to his mistress. Although the hero would have preferred it if his wife had been the one keeping an eye on him. If the young lady had shown a little jealousy and discontent rather than letting him go with a smile into another's arms, he would have been happier. Meanwhile, Raoul concealed himself behind the corner of one of the houses, having finished his surveillance of the lieutenant. He decided to make his way home, hoping that Inez had safely reached the estate. However, alas, it was not so. The Inez that Senora Acevedo was expecting had just entered a jewelry shop. In the display case, she noticed a pendant identical to the one she had inherited from her grandmother, Valinda Olivares. In her past life, Inez had given this pendant to her husband, Emiliano, for the sincerity and kindness he had shown her in their first encounters. As a result, Emiliano was tormented by guilt because Inez had given him herself in such an expensive gift, and he had dragged her down when in the end, they even had to pawn this pendant. At that time, Inez had already given birth to a child by her husband, and he, going to her with the money received for the pendant, collapsed lifeless at the feet of his unfortunate wife. Oscar shot Emiliano, not recognizing him as Inez's husband, and thus nullifying their vows before God. Out of intense grief, Inez caused harm to her and Emiliano's child, and afterward, she took her own life. Raoul saw his mistress riding on horseback and quickly entering the estate. He was deeply shocked, observing Inez's state. In the present, the young lady desired to purchase a pendant that reminded her so strongly of her past. However, the owner of the jewelry shop could not sell it, as the pendant had an owner. By his will, this precious item was displayed in the showcase. The owner of this piece of jewelry wished for the shop owner to inform him as soon as Inez appeared. However, he was tormented by thoughts of whether to inform Lady Escalante about the buyer. When Inez returned to the estate for the second time, Raoul greeted her with a concerned look. The young lady requested him not to make a fuss, as she was feeling terribly. As soon as Inez sat down, she inquired of Raoul about her husband from her past life, Emiliano. The girl was in a fragile mental state, which Raoul immediately noticed, yet he still told his mistress everything he knew about the man who interested Inez. Emiliano caught the eye of the archbishop, and for the following few years, perhaps even a decade, he would be busy painting churches. The heroine asked the owner of the jewelry shop to notify the seller, but if it was indeed Emiliano, it would be impossible to deliver the message to him initially. In her new life as a successful artist under the patronage of the archbishop, a beautiful home, a good wife, Inez was determined to provide the young man with everything he had lacked before. After some reflection, Inez realized that Emiliano could not have left the pendant behind. He would not have treated her so cruelly. She was clearly aware that she was being played with. But who was doing this to her? What wicked games were the gods playing? The only thing uniting Inez's first and second lives was the fact that she dared to take her own life. No matter how much she pondered, first as a 16-year-old and then as a 6-year-old, this was the sole reason for her return to life, as if it were divine punishment. But wasn't it a punishment to repeat the same thing until one settled the score with life? Inez asked Raoul to leave her alone. He did not want to do so. He He realized that his mistress was suffering from that strange ailment from her past again. When the valet left the room, the girl looked at the real pendant that she had inherited from her grandmother. Did Emiliano truly not remember her? Then it meant he had never died, and they had never truly loved each other. Inez could only live with such thoughts. There was nothing easier than finding Emiliano and appearing before him again. Inez wanted to know the answer, but at the same time, she did not. She did not want to be reborn in this terrible world just to die once more. Due to the intense stress, Inez began to suffocate. She was on the verge of losing her breath when Carcel entered the room. Seeing his wife in such a condition, the young man was extremely frightened. The servants of the Escalante estate were greatly perturbed by the recent event. Inez lost consciousness due to strangulation, and Carcel caused quite a commotion. Unlike the others, Raul remained surprisingly calm, as if he had anticipated such an outcome. Even when Captain Masso's doctor inquired about the symptoms, Raul responded promptly. When a hypothesis arose that Inez had experienced a similar attack in the past, the lieutenant attempted to assault the Chamberlain. But it seemed Raul was prepared for this. The young man even claimed that with immediate medical assistance, the symptoms were alleviated. Thus, it appeared this had occurred more than once. The situation with the Acevedo family was also somewhat peculiar. Rumors circulated that the carriage returned without its mistress, and Lady Acevedo's companion remained absent. Furthermore, on the day of the incident, even Raul was taken aback when he discovered that Inez could ride. At times, Raul felt as though he did not know his mistress. It was as if she had become an entirely different person, hailing from another world. No matter how much effort Raul exerted for her, at times he felt that his mistress was somewhere else. Fainting, a sudden departure. Beyond all this, something greater was concealed. Something that evidently was not occurring for the first time and had deep roots in the past. Analyzing all of this, the butler Alfonso decided to send someone to Piers. Carcel angrily berated his colleague and physician by profession because he could not determine the cause of Inez's condition. He merely hypothesized that her suffocation attack had been caused by her fragile lungs and possibly her physical frailty. Due to the stressful situation, her body could not bear the strain, which presumably led to the incident. Certainly, Carcel was dissatisfied with such a superficial explanation of the issue, and the fact that no one could diagnose his wife's ailment. However, he was even more infuriated with himself, as he was unable to assist her in any way. Meanwhile, Raul mentioned that no physician in El Tabao could determine Lady Inez's diagnosis. The protagonist was angered with Raul, as he withheld answers from everyone, despite knowing the truth. Nevertheless, Raul could not disclose what he knew to anyone without Inez's consent. Carcel learned that when he sensed Inez's distance from him, the girl had first fallen victim to this peculiar ailment. At that time, the young man was foolish and oblivious. Out of anger, he flirted with other women in whom he had no genuine interest, only to gain his fiancée's attention. That was when he had gone off to study at the military academy, and even though everyone believed he was avoiding marriage, studying at the academy had been the lieutenant's lifelong dream. But in some way, the onlookers were right. Carcel had tried to forget his fiancée, who paid him no attention. The young man had cast aside all hope and interest in Inez, and, in the end, he found his freedom. Now, however, Carcel was told that his wife was ill, that she could not eat, sleep, breathe. Such had been her life when he had roamed and fled like a scoundrel. Carcel regarded his wife as a very cruel woman. He had been in ignorance at that time. Why did the girl conceal everything from him? Could everything have unfolded somewhat differently if he had known about his fiancée's pain and not run away, not committed such a callous mistake? If only he could have managed to love her. And so, once again, the hero pondered as if he had never loved Inez at all. Previously, he had loved Inez, but even now, he did not object to calling what he felt at the moment love. Shedding tears, Carcel kissed Inez's hand, entreating her to open her eyes and look at him and then call his name. Inez had an innate aversion to children from the very beginning. Pregnancy appeared repugnant to her. Were her child not the progeny of Emiliano, she would not have harbored any affection for him. The young woman tragically extinguished her offspring with Emiliano. Perhaps the infant's demise had already been ordained. All the children that Inez had carried within her womb never saw the light of day. This was not due to the principal heroine's fault, nor the result of any misdeed on her part. No, it was Oscar who claimed the lives of her children. The lives of all, except for her beloved Luca. Emiliano, cradling their son, offered a smile to his wife, urging her not to fear any longer, for their Luca had been found. The heroine realized that these were mere echoes of her desires, manifested in a dream, and nothing could alter what had transpired. Inez once believed she had found happiness with Emiliano and Luca, but later she recognized that it had been a chase for an illusion that would never materialize in her life. When Inez opened her heavy eyelids and regained consciousness, her first request was for Carcel to notify Señor Acevedo about everything. Her husband was, of course, displeased that his wife, who had nearly perished, thought of someone other than him. The young woman noticed that her husband had barely slept all night, and with a somewhat mournful expression, he touched her cheek. It was a tender touch, as if it were transporting her back to childhood. On the day Inez wept after her mother had beaten her, the day they expelled her nanny, who was more devoted to the protagonist than her own mother, the day she suffered in solitude, she felt something akin to this only with her younger brother, Lucago. Carcel, on the other hand, was nothing like Lucago anymore. The reality Inez had sought for so long in her dreams turned out to be less impressive after her awakening. The dream had concluded. The young woman survived. The night she spent in fear of returning to a time 3 years ago had passed. Now, as she regained her composure and recovered from the shock, Inez wished to tell the owner of the jewelry shop where the pendant that reminded her of so much from her past was found not to inform the pendant's owner. When Carcel asked his wife what had happened that day, Inez explained that she had become engrossed in the jewelry and got lost, unable to find Señor Acevedo, so she stopped a passing carriage. After her narration, she engaged in a brief debate with her husband about whether she should get out of bed or not. After succumbing to his persuasion, when her husband requested apple juice for her, Inez noticed that Carcel displayed a newfound aristocratic demeanor. Inez suggested to Carcel that he should go to the dining room for a meal before work, but he firmly refused, still deeply concerned about her. In contrast, Inez behaved as though it was the most ordinary occurrence. Both she and her husband understood that if Raúl did not have the necessary medicine, Inez would no longer be among the living. Carcel was displeased with the nonchalance with which his wife treated her own life. He was upset by the fact that she referred to herself as a defective product and apologized for not preparing him, thus alarming him with her condition. The protagonist continued to castigate herself, delivering cold facts from her perspective to her spouse. Unable to bear it any longer, he clasped the young woman's shoulders to the bed, tears in his eyes, and confessed that he had feared losing her. Unable to hold back tears, Carcel lamented, blaming himself for the rudeness displayed towards Inez and her disdainful words towards herself. He did not know what he could do for his wife, how he could assist her. This brought him great sorrow, but even more painful were the words uttered by his wife, who regarded her suffering as weakness and a defect that rendered her unfit. Yet, in Carcel's eyes, Inez was not a mere object. He could not fathom how she could speak of herself in such a manner. Afterward, the main character left before his wife had the chance to say anything. Carcel simply left the bedroom, but for some reason, Inez felt that her husband had embarked on a path from which he could no longer deviate. The young woman noticed her husband's officer uniform left in the room and considered taking it to him, along with discussing her recent words with him. However, she hesitated, torn between conflicting thoughts. Perhaps this was the most suitable moment for her to distance herself from Carcel. The heroine's train of thought was interrupted when her husband entered the room, inquiring whether the jewelry she had been admiring for so long was beautiful, so beautiful that she had become lost. As Raúl washed the dishes, Inez, glaring sternly at him, asked how much he had disclosed to Carcel since the incident, for the man had appeared to have transformed into an entirely different person following that event. Raúl had not divulged much to anyone, not even to the servants or the physician. However, Inez worried that Carcel would learn about her shortcomings, her mental illness, the self-inflicted injuries, which had forced her father to expend a considerable sum of money to ensure that not a single scratch remained on his daughter's body. Raúl believed that the lieutenant should be informed of everything, but Inez held a different view. Should her husband be privy to all of this, especially when the duration of their marriage was uncertain? The servant sympathized with the main character, and his sympathy horrified her. Inez berated Raúl, stating that Carcel had no connection to that part of her life when she was slowly descending into madness. She was not afraid that he would abandon her upon learning of her condition. Rather, she was terrified that he would bind her with his pity and sympathy. 8 days after the incident with Inez, Carcel began to visit jewelry boutiques, buying almost everything he saw to delight his wife. Carcel sat, attentively listening to the exclamations of his comrade, who couldn't fathom the main character's inability to choose a gift for the young lady, despite his somewhat dissolute reputation. It was later revealed that the lieutenant had never bestowed gifts upon any woman. Carcel also failed to comprehend why everyone valued pre-owned items, and he was mildly disappointed with his father for not gifting Inez a familial heirloom. Nonetheless, this was of little consequence. Carcel believed that previously worn jewelry and possessions could not constitute a meaningful gift. These words, however, angered his father, the Duke of Escalante, yet he still couldn't fathom the profound attachment to old items referred to as family relics. The protagonist's colleague recommended the finest jewelry shop to him. However, upon arriving at the location, the store was closed. Consequently, Carcel had no choice but to enter the first shop he came across. Following a dispute between the spouses, the lieutenant resolved to purchase something. And 8 days had passed since then, yet Carcel had transformed into a bungler who had purchased nothing. In a different shop, the hero endured a lecture about jewelry, and since all the pieces were the latest fashion, he couldn't decipher any of their descriptions. Nevertheless, he decided to buy everything that had been offered thus far. When the issue of the woman's preferred gemstone color came up, Carcel realized that he had entered the shop without even knowing what Anise favored. Until recently, he hadn't even considered that Anise might be interested in precious stones. She had been entirely indifferent to such expensive items. Still, Carcel blamed himself, believing that he should have at least known what would please Anise. Primarily, the young woman wore blue jewelry, but Carcel decided to purchase all that had been previously offered. In any case, he thought the choice should be left to his wife. Then, he noticed a pair of earrings on display and recalled the day of their wedding with Anise. Back then, the family heirloom earrings and necklace his father had given her had looked exquisite on his wife. As the jeweler packed the jewelry, he asked if it was possible that the lieutenant had come to their shop upon Anise's recommendation. At that very moment, Carcel understood that he had arrived precisely where he needed to be. The young man was shown the pendant that had caught Anise's attention, and they narrated everything that had transpired in the store with his wife on that day. Carcel forcefully purchased the pendant, stating that he couldn't wait for the owner's response. He bought it for twice the price, ensuring adequate compensation for the proprietor. Meanwhile, Anise, while transcribing the Bible, remembered her conversation with her husband. Carcel had told her that she could purchase anything she desired with Escalante's money, so she shouldn't become lost, fixated on something. After all, what would happen if she were to lose consciousness in the middle of the street, somewhere they couldn't find her? Each time the main character contemplated this, it seemed to him that leaving the room was a waste of time. Departing without gazing just a bit longer at his wife's countenance was an indulgence he couldn't afford. Carcel was relieved that Anise was unharmed. He held her tightly, causing her to lose herself in her thoughts and inner contradictions. Having concluded her musings, the main character noticed that it was already late at night. During the day, the young woman met people intentionally, while at night, she remained alone with books, transcribing the Bible. Her husband should have returned to the estate long ago. Even if Anise wasn't next to him, there was nothing alarming about that. Even when they were together, they each pursued their own interests. While they sipped wine and water, Carcel gazed out the window at the sea with a cigar in his mouth. Anise read the travel notes of a foreigner. These were evenings in which the young woman merely occupied a place beside her spouse. Not long ago, sitting face to face with him in the dining room, Anise engaged in conversations about the mundane events of the day. And in the morning, she would open her eyes and greet her husband with a smile. In their marriage, it was like the recurring waves of the sea. Each day, each moment, Anise couldn't possibly experience such pleasure. Do not weep so foolishly, Lieutenant. Seek companionship with women as you are accustomed to. The young lady wouldn't have to torment herself with doubts or experience feelings towards her husband. Carcel pulled Anise from her thoughts, placing a small gift before her, a page holder for her writing. Presenting his wife with his gift in the form of a paperweight, Carcel embraced her by the shoulders and, despite her slight resistance, swept her into the room. On their way, they engaged in a conversation that culminated in the protagonist's proposal to find a doctor for Anise in Mendoza. However, the young lady was opposed to the idea, for Carcel was not a mere servant to be tasked with such matters, and she could manage it herself. In her husband's opinion, if any servant were to undertake the search for his wife's treating physician, he would unhesitatingly dispatch that servant. Carcel assured Anise that he would find the finest physician for her, ensuring she received the best medical care and never fell ill again. As servants carried numerous boxes of jewelry into the room, Anise crossed her arms, unable to fathom why her husband had acquired so many seemingly useless items. Another dispute arose between the newlyweds. Anise regarded the jewelry as superfluous, considering she already possessed an ample collection. Conversely, Carcel believed that the previously worn jewelry of others should be replaced with new pieces, as new ones were invariably superior. During the course of this minor argument, Anise finally adorned herself with a pair of earrings that had caught Carcel's attention, greatly delighting him. The young man decided that if his wife liked any of the jewelry he had purchased, it would be a considerable success. The rest was inconsequential. Meanwhile, the servants, observing the spouses, sighed heavily, unsure when the constant moving of boxes would come to an end. In the end, Inez chose to retain all the jewelry under the pretext of gifting them to other women. This was preferable to discarding them in the sea or burning them in a bonfire, as Carcel had suggested. Inez assumed that Carcel spoke similarly to his other women. However, when he playfully bit her cheek and declared that all his extravagance belonged to her alone, she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. She was the first to receive his gift, and even though Carcel's profligacy troubled her, he hoped it did not make her too uncomfortable. Shortly thereafter, the spouses arrived to meet the Acevedo family. For this occasion, Inez donned her jewelry, which Carcel, of course, noticed. The jewelry never returned to the jeweler's shop, but Inez had no intentions of using them herself. She intended to give them as gifts to others, starting with Mrs. Acevedo. However, after this particular gift, she had no plans to give anything else away. She would simply preserve them and, over time, return them untouched. They would remain in pristine condition, as if untouched. As they strolled in the evening with his wife, Carcel declared that the gift presented to Inez would become a cherished family heirloom for the Acevedo family. Inez considered the Acevedos to be fine people and slightly regretted not acquiring an additional ring as a gift. The young lady took a moment to look around and was surprised to discover that she felt quite content. It had been a while since she had enjoyed a leisurely walk. Deep in thought, Inez stumbled and nearly fell, but Carcel's strong hand promptly encircled her waist, preventing her fall. The lieutenant found it difficult to believe that there were people so fragile in the world. However, in his wife's view, he was robust to a fault. As Carcel lifted Inez in his arms, she noticed a fountain statue. Gazing at such a beautiful place, Inez regretted not discovering it earlier. To Carcel, her words sounded as if she were planning to go somewhere. This was indeed the case, for, as Carcel's father had remarked, Inez might need to visit Espazu, and come New Year, Mendoza. Placing the young lady on her feet, Carcel remarked that she could always visit this square if she wished. However, for Inez, the question was whether Carcel would always serve in Kaltstalu. He replied that, as a relative of the imperial family through his maternal lineage, he possessed the genuine right to choose where to go and where to stay. Initially, Inez had something else in mind. She continued to recall various potential futures. Circumstances surrounding her grandmother Valinda's death remained unchanged, as did the other deaths, including within the Escalante family. However, the main character decided not to dwell on such memories in the presence of her spouse. Regardless, Carcel was fated to lose the life he yearned for. She had already disrupted his previous life by marrying him, something he hadn't desired in his past life. But at least, divorce could return it to him. However, just as in the past, Carcel would eventually leave the Navy and cease being a soldier. Inez used to think that Carcel was merely employing his uniform as an attractive facade. But after spending half a month in Kaltstalu, her perspective shifted. The young man loved the Navy, respected his grandfather, and now Inez understood the essence of the freedom he had always longed for. Carcel was the elder son of the Escalante family, and as the Escalantes represented a unit with the hereditary prince of the imperial family, this fact was irrevocable. What other path was left for the protagonist? In Inez's recollections, Carcel had lived a life without the opportunity for inheritance, never married, and ultimately returned to his designated place beside Oscar. At any rate, this was his life. Even if their marriage didn't make Carcel the heir of the family in this lifetime, he would at least remain unaware of it. Perhaps, in the distant future, the freedom Inez could restore for him would merely consist of creating an atmosphere of tranquility, nothing more. Essentially, everything would revert to the past. However, had Carcel become the legitimate heir, but remained unmarried, his life would be somewhat simpler. In any case, the life of the main character would continue on a different course, independent of Inez, and hence, she felt no remorse for daring to change his life. Inez asked Carcel if he would continue his service in the Navy, and he replied that, as long as it suited her, he would prefer to continue serving. In any case, if Carcel did not make Inez a duchess, her father would either reclaim him or kill him. To shift the topic, the young man mentioned that once Inez felt better, he would teach her horseback riding. Inez wished to commence the lessons immediately, but Carcel asked her to wait a bit longer, which left Lady Escalante somewhat displeased. Later, the young man inquired if Inez remembered the story of the mermaid depicted as a statue on the square. He had shared this tale with her previously. Just like other local legends, there existed an enticing, well-known legend on the shores of Kaltstalu. In this world, mermaids existed, exquisite yet devoid of hearts, devoid of any emotion. Since they were oblivious to feelings, they were also ignorant of love, living their lives without emotional wounds. Distrusting humans, mermaids effortlessly entrapped those who fell in love with them. One day, a sailor serving under an admiral saved a mermaid washed ashore and lost his head over her. The girl he admired wished to test the sailor's feelings, just as other mermaids did. Love confessions were insufficient, as they believed human words held no meaning. "If you love me, let's live in the sea together," the mermaid declared. And so the soldier set off after her. He ventured deeper and deeper until he began to suffocate. Mermaids easily forgot that humans could not breathe underwater, and the foolish sailor, blindly in love with the mermaid, brought about his own death. Believing he could breathe on land again, the mermaid belatedly pulled the lifeless sailor onto a rock. He had drowned once more, this time in the world of the mermaid, where she could never meet him. Inez did not ensnare Carcel. She did not thirst for his love, nor did she desire to understand him or ask him to leave with her. She had not committed any wrongdoing or engaged in the actions of mermaids. Nevertheless, as the sailor was a fool, following love to his certain doom, Carcel too was a fool, for he loved a girl akin to a mermaid. He loved her so deeply that he was willing to drown while following her, so deeply that he did not even comprehend how to breathe. Carcel sometimes loved his wife in a manner that appeared entirely foolish. It seemed to him that just as the mermaid did not love the soldier, likewise, Inez did not love him. She might not love him until the very end. But the image of Inez, smiling beside the fountain under the starlight, would eternally remain with Carcel. So, even if he were to drown, it would be exquisite. Meanwhile, Butler Alfonso was listening to the report of one of his subordinates. He had asked the young man to inquire about Inez's illness, and as it turned out, nothing was known. All traces were being erased. All the physicians who had previously treated Inez had fled, facing immediate failure. Therefore, the informer concluded that Inez suffered not from a rare lung ailment but from a sort of mental disorder. Upon crossing the threshold of her abode, Inez was met by a housemaid who seemed perplexed by the young lady's return. Inez, however, promptly disclosed to her the revelation that Carcel had seduced the stableman and forbidden Inez from accessing a carriage or horse, citing her mild evening indisposition as justification. Henceforth, within the estate, a transformation commenced as everyone began to emulate the ways of Carcel. Inez was scrutinized, with all anxious that she might succumb to grave illness from a mere sneeze. All were genuinely concerned and attentive, emotions that in previous lifetimes, Inez had scarcely experienced, let alone envisioned. In contrast to the uptight, rule-bound denizens of Piers, the inhabitants of the Kaltstalu estate exuded relaxation and authenticity. Therefore, their concern was largely unpretentious and manifested in a more rustic manner. Inez couldn't recall ever having lived in an environment suffused with such unbridled sincerity. From the very day the housemaid informed Inez that she could not only receive guests, but also extend invitations. And as long as Carcel denied her permission to venture out while worrying about her health, Inez became preoccupied with a plethora of social engagements. Elderly, influential married ladies, young wives of junior officers, wives and daughters from lesser-known nobility, as well as opulent commoners and daughters of entrepreneurs visited her. They ranged from those seeking to establish their initial connections within these circles to those aiming to catch Carcel's eye, albeit discreetly. Comparing the present time with the period when Inez was the heiress, it was much less complex. In Mendoza, where every uttered word was meticulously weighed, no effort was required, for there, psychological warfare was as obvious as daylight and almost endearing. Yet it did not offer such a delectable prey as the precious name and lineage of Inez Escalante. Although, unlike that era, Inez now needed to feign being a kind senora.